The North African desert was more than a barren expanse of sand and rock. It was a strategic lifeline that held the key to controlling the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and the vital Suez Canal, which linked the British Empire to India and its eastern colonies. By 1942, the conflict in North Africa had intensified, becoming a theater where the fate of global supply lines and colonial possessions would be decided. Both Axis and Allied powers recognized that control of this desert could tip the balance of the war in Europe and beyond, making it a high-stakes arena for strategic maneuvering. Erwin Rommel, the celebrated Desert Fox, had become the figurehead of Axis ambitions in North Africa. Leading a combination of German and Italian forces, Rommel had already demonstrated his ability to exploit speed, mobility, and surprise to devastating effect. His forces had advanced across Libya with remarkable efficiency, overwhelming lightly defended British positions, and pushing toward Egypt. Rommel's mastery of desert warfare was built on his ability to use armored divisions in rapid, unpredictable thrusts, outflanking opponents, and striking supply lines with devastating precision. The Axis advance in the desert was not merely tactical, it carried symbolic weight, showing the world that Germany could project power far beyond the European continent. On the other side, the British defenses in Egypt represented a crucial barrier to Axis expansion. The Eighth Army, composed of British, Australian, New Zealand, and South African units, was charged with defending both the approaches to Alexandria and, more importantly, the Suez Canal. This waterway was vital for transporting troops, fuel, and supplies between Europe and Asia. Its loss would have endangered the entire British Empire, cutting off access to India, the Middle East, and essential oil supplies. Therefore, holding Egypt was not just a defensive task, it was a matter of global strategic necessity. As Rommel's forces approached the frontier of Egypt, the desert itself became a battlefield in which logistics and endurance were as important as firepower. The harsh terrain presented unique challenges: extreme temperatures, treacherous sand dunes, and scarce water sources tested the physical limits of men and machines alike. Supply lines were long and vulnerable, meaning that the ability to sustain offensive operations depended as much on efficient logistics as on tactical skill. The Allies had to ensure that fuel, ammunition, and rations were constantly moving forward, often across hundreds of miles of hostile terrain, while Axis forces faced similar difficulties trying to maintain momentum in their rapid advance. The strategic importance of North Africa extended beyond the immediate theater. Control of the region would allow the Axis powers to threaten British positions in the Middle East and secure access to oil supplies in the region, fueling their war machine. Conversely, for the Allies, successfully holding the line meant preserving a crucial base for operations into southern Europe, particularly Italy, and maintaining morale across the British Empire. Both sides recognized that the battle was not only about desert territory, it was about global supply, imperial reach, and the ability to sustain long-term operations. Rommel's approach was audacious, relying on fast-moving armored thrusts combined with coordinated infantry and artillery. He employed deception, night movements, and aggressive reconnaissance to outmaneuver the slower, more methodical Allied forces. Italian divisions provided additional manpower, though they often suffered from equipment limitations and logistical issues. The Desert Fox's ability to inspire his troops, combined with tactical brilliance, gave the Axis a psychological edge that complemented their material advantages. Meanwhile, the British command, under generals such as Claude Auchinleck, focused on building strong defensive positions across the desert's narrow choke points. Mines, fortified positions, and careful placement of tanks and artillery aimed to slow Rommel's advance and create opportunities for counterattacks. British intelligence, including code-breaking efforts and reconnaissance, provided critical information about Axis movements, allowing the defenders to anticipate attacks and allocate resources effectively. Despite being initially on the back foot, the 8th Army understood that careful preparation, coupled with resilient personnel and knowledge of the terrain, could neutralize the Desert Fox's speed and surprise. The opening phase of the North African campaign was thus a study in contrasts. On one side, Rommel's forces moved with speed, audacity, and tactical ingenuity. On the other, British defenders relied on preparation, intelligence, and strategic positioning. Each side had to contend with the harsh realities of desert warfare, where the sun, sand, and scarcity were as deadly as enemy bullets. The desert demanded endurance, adaptability, and constant vigilance, and those who could master these elements had a significant advantage in the campaign. In summary, the North African theater in 1942 was a critical crossroads in the Second World War. The desert stretched from Libya to Egypt, a vast expanse that tested human endurance and military strategy alike. Rommel's Axis forces advanced with speed and skill, threatening Egypt and the Suez Canal, while British defenders prepared meticulously to hold the line. Success in this campaign would have far-reaching consequences for control of the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and the global supply chains that sustained the Allied war effort. The Desert Fox and the Allied forces were about to clash in a battle where strategy, logistics, and courage would decide the fate of nations, and the sands of North Africa would soon witness the thunder of artillery, the roar of tanks, and the heroism of soldiers fighting in one of the most iconic campaigns of the Second World War. Erwin Rommel, later immortalized as the Desert Fox, emerged as a formidable force in North Africa through his innovative approach to desert warfare. Unlike conventional commanders who relied heavily on entrenched positions, Rommel emphasized speed, surprise, and mobility, using armored units to strike rapidly and exploit weaknesses in Allied lines. His tactics combined mechanized infantry with concentrated tank assaults, coordinated artillery, and aggressive reconnaissance, allowing him to outmaneuver forces that were larger in number but slower in execution. The desert, with its vast open spaces and treacherous terrain, became both his battlefield and his ally, as he leveraged the environment to maximize the effectiveness of his mobile forces. Rommel's early campaigns in Libya and Egypt demonstrated the effectiveness of this approach. In battles such as those at Gazala and Tobruk, German and Italian forces moved with astonishing speed, encircling and overwhelming Allied units that were often unprepared for the rapid thrusts. His use of combined arms, coordinating tanks, artillery, and aircraft, allowed for devastating advances, while his keen sense of timing and tactical audacity kept the Allies constantly reacting. Each victory reinforced Rommel's reputation, boosting Axis morale and creating a psychological advantage that extended beyond the battlefield. Soldiers under his command were inspired by his boldness and decisiveness, often willing to endure harsh desert conditions because they trusted in his leadership. The successes of the Desert Fox presented a profound challenge for the Allies. Traditional defensive strategies, which emphasized fixed positions and linear defenses, proved vulnerable to Rommel's highly mobile operations. British and Commonwealth forces had to adapt to a fluid battlefield where front lines could shift hundreds of miles in days, and where a single breach could disrupt entire supply networks. Commanders struggled to coordinate reinforcements, maintain communication across vast desert distances, and counter fast-moving armored columns. The desert's unforgiving nature compounded these difficulties, with sand, heat, and scarcity testing the endurance of troops on both sides. Rommel's ability to anticipate enemy movements and exploit weaknesses was a hallmark of his command style. He relied on intelligence, reconnaissance, and the flexibility of his units to react swiftly to changes in the battlefield. At times, this meant taking calculated risks, such as advancing without full supply lines or engaging in frontal attacks against prepared positions, trusting in the skill and morale of his troops. While these risks occasionally led to costly engagements, They often paid off by maintaining initiative and keeping Allied forces off balance. The early victories in Libya and Egypt also had broader strategic implications. Each success allowed the Axis to advance closer to the Suez Canal, a vital artery for Allied supply routes and global communication. Capturing Egypt would have jeopardized British control of the Middle East, threatening oil supplies and the broader logistics of the Allied war effort. Rommel's advances forced the Allies to divert resources, reinforce positions, and reconsider operational priorities, stretching their capabilities thin across the desert theater. At the same time, Rommel's campaigns exposed the importance of logistics and supply in desert warfare. Despite his tactical brilliance, sustaining rapid advances over hundreds of miles of sand required meticulous planning for fuel, ammunition, and rations. The Allies recognized this vulnerability and began to exploit it in later engagements, understanding that even the Desert Fox's momentum could be checked if supply lines were disrupted. The combination of tactical skill and logistical awareness would define the campaigns that followed, as both sides adapted to the challenges of mobile desert combat. Rommel's rise was not merely about victories on the battlefield, it was also about psychological impact. His early successes created a sense of inevitability around Axis advances, pressuring Allied commanders and emboldening Axis troops. Reports of his audacious maneuvers circulated widely, elevating him to near-mythical status in both Axis propaganda and Allied accounts. This aura of invincibility contributed to the morale advantage of German forces while placing a heavy burden on Allied leaders to find ways to counteract a commander whose reputation often preceded him. Despite these achievements, Allied forces were gradually learning to counter Rommel's tactics. The combination of intelligence gathering, defensive fortifications, and the eventual arrival of reinforcements began to slow Axis momentum. Units became more flexible, artillery support more effective, and defensive positions adapted to the mobile nature of the enemy. The stage was set for the protracted and decisive battles that would determine control of North Africa, particularly at El Alamein, where the Desert Fox would face an Allied force better prepared to withstand and repel his innovative offensives. In summary, Rommel's early campaigns in North Africa exemplified the impact of leadership, mobility, and tactical innovation in modern warfare. His successes in Libya and Egypt boosted Axis morale, showcased the effectiveness of armored warfare, and forced the Allies to adapt to the unique challenges of desert combat. The Desert Fox's combination of audacity, strategic foresight, and ability to inspire his troops made him a formidable opponent and set the tone for the North African campaign, leaving a legacy that would influence both Axis strategy and Allied responses in the battles to come. Rommel had risen in the desert not just as a commander, but as a symbol of initiative, cunning, and relentless drive, compelling the Allies to evolve rapidly or risk losing the key gateway to Egypt and the Middle East. His early successes were a prelude to the epic confrontations that would eventually determine the fate of the North African theater and demonstrate the interplay of strategy, leadership, and human endurance in one of the most challenging environments of the Second World War. By mid-1942, the North African campaign had reached a critical juncture. Rommel's forces, having advanced rapidly across Libya, threatened Egypt and the Suez Canal, a vital lifeline for the British Empire. In response, the Allies needed to halt the seemingly unstoppable momentum of the Desert Fox, and the responsibility fell to Lieutenant General Bernard Law Montgomery, recently appointed commander of the 8th Army. Montgomery's arrival marked a turning point in Allied strategy, bringing discipline, meticulous planning, and renewed morale to a beleaguered force facing a cunning and mobile adversary. Montgomery quickly assessed the battlefield and recognized that the defense of El Alamein was pivotal. The region offered natural advantages, a narrow corridor between the Mediterranean coast and the impassable Qattara Depression, a stretch of salt marsh and desert too treacherous for mechanized forces. By focusing on this choke point, Montgomery could force Rommel's armor into predictable paths, limiting the effectiveness of his rapid flanking maneuvers and exploiting the terrain to strengthen defensive positions. El Alamein became not just a geographic location but a symbolic bastion where the fate of Egypt, and perhaps the wider Mediterranean theater, would be decided. Defensive preparations began immediately. Montgomery organized the Eighth Army into a layered defensive system. Infantry units were positioned in strongpoints, supported by well-placed artillery emplacements that could deliver concentrated fire on advancing Axis columns. Anti-tank obstacles, including mines, ditches, and barbed wire, were constructed to channel enemy armor into kill zones. Reconnaissance patrols scouted the desert expanses, identifying potential routes of attack and reporting on Axis activity. Every unit was drilled on defensive tactics, ensuring that the soldiers could respond cohesively under the stress of desert combat. A crucial component of Montgomery's defensive strategy was the integration of logistics and supply chains. Desert warfare placed enormous demands on fuel, ammunition, and water. Montgomery prioritized secure supply lines, ensuring that frontline troops could be resupplied efficiently while minimizing the vulnerability of convoys to enemy raids. Reinforcements from across the British Empire, including Australian, New Zealand, South African, and Indian units, were gradually funneled into the front lines, boosting the strength and resilience of the Eighth Army. Supply depots, fuel dumps, and field hospitals were strategically located behind the front, prepared to sustain operations during the anticipated Axis assault. Montgomery also understood the psychological dimension of defense. Previous Allied setbacks had left soldiers wary and cautious. He emphasized confidence, discipline, and morale, fostering an environment where troops trusted both their leadership and their training. Regular briefings, rigorous drills, and a visible presence among the troops reinforced cohesion and combat readiness. Soldiers were taught to anticipate Rommel's aggressive maneuvers, to hold firm under fire, and to respond with coordinated action rather than panic or improvisation. This focus on preparation extended beyond tactical skill. It cultivated a mindset capable of enduring the Desert Fox's signature rapid strikes. Artillery and armored units were coordinated to maximize firepower against Rommel's mechanized formations. Forward observers were trained to call on precise artillery strikes on approaching tanks, while mobile reserves were positioned to counter breakthroughs. Engineers laid minefields and anticipated avenues of advance, and reconnaissance aircraft monitored the desert for troop movements. The combination of static defenses and flexible counterattack forces allowed Montgomery to create a dynamic defensive network that could absorb Axis assaults while maintaining the potential for offensive action when the opportunity arose. The British preparations were not limited to the battlefield alone. Intelligence efforts, including code-breaking and signals interception, provided Montgomery with critical insights into Axis supply lines, troop dispositions, and operational intentions. By combining tactical awareness with strategic planning, he was able to anticipate Rommel's attacks and deploy forces effectively, mitigating the Desert Fox's advantage in maneuver warfare. Every defensive measure, from fortifications to logistics, reflected an understanding that victory in the desert required both preparation and adaptability. Moreover, Montgomery recognized the importance of unity and coordination among diverse Allied contingents. British, Australian, New Zealand, South African, and Indian troops operated together under a single command structure, requiring careful integration of communications, tactics, and supply. Differences in equipment, training, and doctrine were reconciled through joint exercises, ensuring that multinational forces could operate effectively as a cohesive entity. This coordination enhanced the strength of the Eighth Army, transforming it into a force capable of withstanding the full weight of Rommel's assault. In essence, the preparations at El Alamein represented more than defensive measures. They embodied a comprehensive strategy designed to exploit terrain, sustain morale, integrate logistics, and anticipate enemy actions. Montgomery's meticulous approach contrasted sharply with the aggressive, improvisational tactics of Rommel, setting the stage for a confrontation that would test both leadership and the resilience of soldiers in the harsh desert environment. By the time the Axis forces approached, the British defenses were formidable. The combination of natural terrain advantages, layered fortifications, secure supply lines, and disciplined troops meant that any attempt to break through would come at a heavy cost. Rommel faced an Eighth Army that was not only prepared tactically but also mentally resilient, aware of the stakes, and coordinated across multiple arms of service. Ultimately, Montgomery's preparations at El Alamein laid the groundwork for one of the decisive battles of the North African campaign. The careful planning, reinforcement of positions, and integration of intelligence and logistics created a defensive bulwark capable of absorbing Rommel's initial strikes while preserving the potential for a counteroffensive. The line held not just by fortifications but by the cohesion, training, and resolve of the men who manned it. The Desert Fox would soon learn that speed and audacity alone would not be enough to breach a well-prepared, united defense, setting the stage for the dramatic clashes that would follow in the sands of North Africa. As the sun rose over the barren expanse of the North African desert, Rommel's forces prepared to unleash one of the most aggressive offensives of the campaign. Known for his daring maneuvers and rapid advances, the Desert Fox had meticulously studied the Allied dispositions at El Alamein. His plan was simple in concept but deadly in execution: use speed, surprise, and concentrated armored thrusts to break through the British lines, seize key positions, and open a corridor toward Egypt and the Suez Canal. The stakes were monumental, and both sides knew that the coming clash could determine the fate of the entire North African theater. Rommel's offensive relied heavily on the combined arms approach. Tanks spearheaded the advance, supported closely by mechanized infantry, artillery, and mobile anti-tank units. The desert's open terrain allowed for rapid movement, enabling German armored columns to exploit gaps and outflank defensive positions. Reconnaissance units scouted ahead, identifying weak points and relaying vital information to coordinate artillery barrages. Speed and coordination were paramount. The success of the attack depended on hitting multiple targets simultaneously and keeping the Allies off balance. The initial tank engagements were fierce and chaotic. British and Commonwealth armored units, dug into prepared defensive positions, met Rommel's panzers with heavy fire. The desert became a dynamic chessboard, with vehicles maneuvering across sand dunes, shell craters, and rocky outcrops. German tanks attempted to punch through strategic points, often advancing in tight formations to maximize firepower, while British defenders deployed anti-tank guns, artillery, and mobile reserves to counter the onslaught. Each clash tested not only firepower but the flexibility, communication, and morale of both sides. Infantry clashes were equally brutal. As tanks collided or stalled, mechanized infantry dismounted to engage in close combat. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery fire created a constant cacophony across the battlefield. Soldiers endured blistering heat by day and freezing nights, sandstorms that reduced visibility, and the relentless pressure of enemy assaults. The desert environment amplified the intensity of combat, as units had to contend simultaneously with the terrain, logistics, and the unyielding enemy. Survival required endurance, discipline, and quick adaptation to rapidly changing conditions. Rommel's strategy emphasized exploitation of Allied weaknesses. He concentrated attacks on sectors that appeared lightly defended or where reconnaissance suggested overextension. The goal was not simply to advance linearly but to encircle, isolate, and collapse portions of the Eighth Army. This approach forced the Allies to remain vigilant, constantly shifting units to plug gaps and respond to flanking maneuvers. Every miscalculation could allow German armor to penetrate deep into the desert, threatening supply lines and communications critical to sustaining British defensive positions. Allied forces faced intense pressure as they sought to hold these key positions. Defensive preparations laid by Montgomery and his staff proved crucial. Infantry and artillery were strategically positioned to maximize firepower against advancing armor, while mobile reserves were ready to respond to breakthroughs. Coordination between units ensured that defenders could react to sudden thrusts, often using depth and overlapping fields of fire to blunt attacks. While outnumbered in certain engagements, the combination of well-prepared positions, intelligence on German movements, and disciplined execution allowed the Allies to absorb the impact of Rommel's offensive. The battle also highlighted the importance of logistics and supply in desert warfare. Rommel's rapid advance stretched his supply lines thin, making it increasingly difficult to provide fuel, ammunition, and water to frontline units. British forces, while also challenged, benefited from shorter lines. In the vast, sun-scorched expanse of the North African desert, victory often depended as much on information and foresight as on tanks, artillery, or infantry. While Rommel's armored divisions thundered across Libya and Egypt, the Allies relied heavily on intelligence and reconnaissance to anticipate his moves, counter his audacious tactics, and prevent the Desert Fox from exploiting vulnerabilities. This invisible battlefield of information often proved as decisive as any tank engagement or infantry assault, shaping the outcome of the North African campaign. At the heart of Allied intelligence efforts was signals interception and code-breaking, commonly known under the Ultra program. British cryptographers monitored Axis radio transmissions, deciphering German and Italian communications whenever possible. Each intercepted message offered crucial insight into troop movements, supply situations, and planned offensives. By analyzing these transmissions, British commanders could predict Rommel's objectives, understand the composition of attacking forces, and prepare defensive positions accordingly. In many ways, Ultra acted as an early warning system, enabling the Allies to respond proactively rather than reactively to Axis advances. Beyond signals intelligence, reconnaissance patrols on land and in the air were essential for providing a real-time picture of the battlefield. Reconnaissance aircraft flew over desert expanses, photographing enemy columns, tracking tank formations, and mapping supply routes. Pilots braved anti-aircraft fire in harsh desert conditions, delivering information that allowed commanders to adjust their strategies with precision. Ground patrols, often composed of scouts and light cavalry units, probed ahead of the main forces, confirming positions, identifying minefields, and observing enemy fortifications. These patrols risked ambush and capture, yet their contributions were critical in filling gaps in intelligence and confirming Ultra's findings. The combination of signals intelligence and reconnaissance allowed the Allies to anticipate Rommel's maneuvers in ways that pure force could not. For instance, by tracking supply convoys and armored movements, commanders could predict which sectors of the front were likely to be attacked first, allowing them to reinforce vulnerable positions or set traps for advancing panzer divisions. This proactive approach contrasted with previous encounters in the desert, where surprise and speed often gave the Axis forces the upper hand. Now, with accurate intelligence, the Eighth Army could allocate artillery, infantry, and armor effectively, disrupting Rommel's carefully timed thrusts. Reconnaissance also informed tactical adjustments during engagements. Spotters on the ground could relay artillery coordinates directly to gunners, allowing preempt. In the unforgiving expanses of the North African desert, where the horizon seemed endless and the sun blazed mercilessly, intelligence became one of the most crucial weapons in the Allies' arsenal. While Rommel's armored columns and mechanized infantry moved with precision and audacity across the sand, the Allies understood that knowing the enemy's intentions and movements could turn the tide of battle even before the first shell was fired. This realization made signals intelligence, aerial reconnaissance, and ground patrols indispensable tools in countering the Desert Fox's aggressive campaigns. At the center of this intelligence network was Ultra, the British program dedicated to intercepting and deciphering German communications. By capturing Axis radio transmissions and decrypting their codes, British cryptographers gained unprecedented insight into Rommel's operational plans. Information regarding the location of panzer divisions, supply movements, and planned offensives allowed the Eighth Army to anticipate attacks rather than merely react to them. Ultra provided a strategic advantage, giving Montgomery and his staff the ability to allocate troops, artillery, and reserves to threatened sectors before the Axis forces arrived, thereby blunting the momentum of Rommel's swift desert offensives. However, signals intelligence alone was insufficient. The Allies relied heavily on reconnaissance patrols and aerial observation to supplement the data obtained from intercepted communications. Reconnaissance aircraft scouted the desert, photographing enemy formations, tracking supply convoys, and mapping potential routes for advance or retreat. These flights were perilous. Pilots had to contend with anti-aircraft fire, harsh weather, and the vast, open desert, which offered no cover. Despite the risks, their work provided actionable intelligence that could influence the timing and concentration of Allied counterattacks, often allowing commanders to predict the movement of Axis units several hours or even days in advance. Ground reconnaissance complemented aerial efforts. Scouts and light cavalry units ventured into forward areas to observe German positions, verify the intelligence gathered from Ultra, and detect hidden obstacles or minefields. These patrols risked ambush and capture, yet their reports were critical for shaping defensive deployments and informing artillery targeting. Every piece of information gathered, whether from the sky or the desert floor, contributed to a comprehensive understanding of enemy activity, enabling more precise and effective responses. The integration of these intelligence sources allowed the Allies to adapt their strategies dynamically. For example, by anticipating the Axis approach through reconnaissance and decrypted communications, Montgomery could reinforce key positions, concentrate artillery fire, and maneuver armored units to intercept the Desert Fox's spearheads. Such preparation reduced the risk of surprise, which had previously allowed Rommel to achieve significant victories through speed and audacity. Moreover, intelligence-driven planning permitted the Allies to create layered defenses, with overlapping fields of fire, preposition reserves, and contingency plans tailored to expected enemy maneuvers. Intelligence also played a psychological role. Knowing that the Allies could monitor movements and anticipate attacks undermined the confidence of Axis commanders, while bolstering morale among Allied troops who trusted that their leadership had foreknowledge of enemy actions. Soldiers understood that their positions were chosen based on strategic insights rather than chance, providing a sense of security even under the threat of Rommel's swift armored assaults. Crucially, reconnaissance and intelligence were interdependent with logistics and coordination. Supply lines, artillery placements, and reinforcement routes were planned using data from Ultra and scouting reports. This integration ensured that ammunition, fuel, and rations could reach the front lines efficiently, even as the desert itself presented formidable obstacles. By linking intelligence with operational planning, Montgomery created a framework in which information flowed seamlessly from observation to action, transforming knowledge into decisive battlefield advantage. The role of intelligence at El Alamein exemplified a broader principle of modern warfare. Success often hinges not only on manpower and firepower but on the ability to see and understand the enemy before engagement. Ultra, reconnaissance flights, and patrols formed a comprehensive picture of Axis operations, enabling proactive rather than reactive tactics. The Desert Fox's famed speed and unpredictability were countered not solely by defensive positions but by anticipation, foresight, and the capacity to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. In summary, The eyes of the desert, the combination of signals intelligence, reconnaissance patrols, and careful operational planning, gave the Allies a critical edge against Rommel's forces. By detecting movements, predicting maneuvers, and informing tactical decisions, intelligence allowed the Eighth Army to hold the line, reinforce vulnerable sectors, and prepare for decisive engagements. In a campaign where the desert itself was a harsh adversary, knowledge of the enemy became a weapon as vital as any tank, artillery piece, or infantry brigade. Through these efforts, the Allies demonstrated that information can be as lethal as firepower, shaping strategy, protecting lives, and ultimately contributing to the success at El Alamein, a victory built as much on insight and foresight as on courage in combat. In the shifting sands of North Africa, the Desert Fox's brilliance met the unyielding vigilance of Allied intelligence, setting the stage for one of the most decisive confrontations of the Second World War. The desert sun cast long, harsh shadows over the dunes of El Alamein as both Axis and Allied forces prepared for what would become the opening skirmishes of a campaign that could determine control of North Africa. These initial clashes, though limited in scale compared to the battles to come, served as a crucial testing ground for strategy, logistics, and leadership on both sides. Each engagement revealed strengths and weaknesses, shaping the approaches and decisions that would define the outcome of the campaign. Rommel, the Desert Fox, led his forces with characteristic boldness, probing the British lines to identify vulnerabilities. His columns of tanks and mechanized infantry moved swiftly across the desert, relying on speed, coordination, and the element of surprise to outmaneuver defenders. Small reconnaissance attacks and forward thrusts tested the British defensive positions, gauging the effectiveness of artillery, minefields, and anti-tank deployments. These skirmishes were not simply about territory, they were experiments in tactics, allowing both sides to learn how their forces performed under the unforgiving conditions of desert warfare. On the Allied side, Montgomery had positioned the Eighth Army to absorb the initial attacks while maintaining the flexibility to respond effectively. British and Commonwealth forces used the narrow corridor between the Mediterranean coast and the Qattara Depression to their advantage, channeling Axis advances into predetermined kill zones. Anti-tank guns and artillery batteries were strategically placed to cover open desert expanses, while infantry units were ready to respond to breakthroughs. These early encounters provided vital information on the effectiveness of the defensive arrangements, highlighting areas where gaps existed or coordination could be improved. The skirmishes often involved small-scale tank and artillery engagements, which, while not decisive in isolation, offered valuable lessons. The British observed how Rommel's tanks exploited speed and maneuverability to outflank static defenses, prompting adjustments in deployment and countermaneuvers. Conversely, German forces gained insights into the defensive resilience of Allied infantry and the lethal efficiency of well-coordinated artillery fire. Both sides refined their approach, understanding that control of the battlefield depended as much on logistics and communication as on sheer firepower. Leadership played a pivotal role in sustaining morale during these early engagements. Officers on both sides had to maintain order and cohesion amid the chaos of desert combat, often making rapid decisions under fire. For the Allies, seeing their positions hold against Rommel's probing attacks reinforced confidence in Montgomery's strategy and in the preparedness of their units. For the Axis, the ability to adapt to unexpected resistance and coordinate attacks under harsh conditions tested Rommel's command abilities and the endurance of his troops. Each skirmish became a microcosm of the larger campaign, emphasizing that leadership, morale, and discipline were just as crucial as tanks, guns, and ammunition. Logistics proved to be a defining factor as well. Early confrontations revealed the challenges of moving fuel, water, and supplies across the desert. Units that advanced too quickly risked stretching their supply lines, leaving tanks and infantry vulnerable. Conversely, defenders who mismanaged resources could find themselves unable to sustain prolonged resistance. These lessons from the first skirmishes informed subsequent planning, highlighting the delicate balance between aggression and caution in the desert theater. By the conclusion of these initial clashes, both sides had gained critical insights. The Allies learned which positions were most vulnerable, how to concentrate firepower effectively, and how to coordinate infantry, armor, and artillery. Rommel and his forces assessed the strengths of the Eighth Army, identifying opportunities for penetration but also recognizing the growing competence and organization of the defenders. The desert had provided a testing ground, revealing the human, mechanical, and tactical limits of both armies. These early confrontations also had a psychological impact. The ability of units to withstand attacks and respond effectively influenced morale across the front. Soldiers on both sides were acutely aware that the campaign's outcome could hinge on endurance, cohesion, and adaptability, not just numbers or equipment. Successes, however small, bolstered confidence and fostered a sense of purpose, while setbacks underscored the dangers of underestimating the opponent. In essence, the first skirmishes at El Alamein were much more than preliminary clashes. They were the crucible in which tactics, leadership, and logistics were tested and refined. The lessons learned informed the planning and execution of the larger, decisive battles that would soon engulf the desert. By observing how their forces performed under pressure, commanders could adapt, anticipate enemy moves, and optimize the deployment of men and machines for the confrontation that would determine control of North Africa. The desert, with its harsh sun, shifting sands, and unforgiving terrain, became a teacher. It exposed weaknesses, rewarded ingenuity, and demanded resilience. Both Rommel and Montgomery understood that the outcome of the campaign would not be decided in a single engagement, but in the cumulative effect of preparation, adaptation, and the relentless pressure of sustained combat. These first clashes were the opening chapter of a campaign where strategy, endurance, and leadership would meet head-on, setting the stage for one of the most iconic battles of the Second World War. In the vast, unforgiving expanse of the North African desert, logistics were as decisive as bullets and tanks. The sands stretched endlessly, concealing both opportunity and danger, and the ability to supply, reinforce, and sustain troops often determined victory or defeat more than tactical brilliance alone. Fuel, water, ammunition, and food were the lifeblood of armies operating hundreds of miles from secure bases, and in the desert, these necessities became both the enabler of advance and the Achilles heel of overreach. Rommel's rapid offensives, while tactically impressive, stretched the Axis supply lines perilously thin. Panzer divisions and mechanized infantry moved at blistering speed across Libya and into Egypt, but each kilometer forward meant longer lines of trucks carrying fuel, artillery shells, rations, and water. The desert offered little cover, and the hot, sandy terrain increased wear on vehicles, causing breakdowns that further stressed supply operations. Axis supply convoys became vulnerable to air attacks, reconnaissance raids, and mechanical failures. The faster Rommel advanced, the more tenuous his logistical situation became, creating critical vulnerabilities that Montgomery and his staff were keen to exploit. For the British, understanding the importance of supply was central to their defensive strategy at El Alamein. Engineers and planners worked tirelessly to ensure that ammunition, fuel, and provisions reached the front lines reliably. Roads were reinforced, water sources secured, and depot networks carefully coordinated to minimize exposure to German artillery or airstrikes. Forward supply points were established, allowing tanks and infantry to receive the resources they needed for both defense and counterattack without excessive delay. Engineers laid temporary roads, reinforced tracks through sand, and maintained a constant flow of supplies despite the challenges posed by heat, wind, and dust storms. The contrast between the Axis and Allied logistics became increasingly evident. While Rommel relied on speed and improvisation, British planners emphasized redundancy, coordination, and security. Fuel convoys were accompanied by armed escorts, ammunition stockpiles were dispersed to prevent catastrophic losses from bombing, water and food were rationed and distributed efficiently to sustain frontline troops. By mastering logistics, the Allies ensured that their forces could withstand prolonged engagements, maintain morale, and respond flexibly to sudden attacks or breakthroughs. Supply lines were not merely a matter of provisioning, they were strategic lifelines that shaped the tempo of battle. The availability or scarcity of fuel dictated how far armored units could maneuver, how quickly infantry could be reinforced, and whether artillery could be redeployed to threatened sectors. Rommel's overstretched lines meant that delays, ambushes, or equipment failures could halt an advance, giving the Allies precious time to strengthen defenses and prepare countermeasures. Every vehicle lost or truck delayed increased the pressure on Axis forces, demonstrating how logistics could magnify or undermine even the most brilliant tactical plans. Moreover, the desert itself amplified the challenges of supply. High temperatures caused engines to overheat, sand clogged mechanisms, and windstorms reduced visibility for convoy drivers. Water scarcity threatened both personnel and vehicles, making careful planning essential. The British recognized that control of key logistical nodes, roads, wells, and supply depots, could effectively dictate the flow of the battle. Engineers and logistics officers worked continuously to repair roads, mark safe routes, and coordinate timing so that resources arrived at exactly the right moment, preventing shortages from hampering frontline operations. The human element of logistics was equally critical. Drivers, engineers, and supply officers often faced enemy fire, the threat of ambush, and extreme environmental conditions. Their skill, courage, and endurance were vital in maintaining operational tempo. Desert warfare required not only strategy but also the ability to keep men and machines functioning under relentless strain. The efficiency and reliability of Allied supply chains allowed Montgomery's forces to hold key positions, rotate units effectively, and sustain prolonged defensive and offensive operations. In contrast, Rommel's forces sometimes suffered from improvisation and risk-taking that strained supply capabilities. Forward units occasionally outran their support, leaving tanks and artillery vulnerable. Attempts to rapidly exploit breakthroughs could falter if fuel or ammunition did not arrive in time, and the desert terrain offered no shortcuts or hiding places for delayed convoys. These vulnerabilities underscored the importance of integrating logistics with operational planning, a principle that Montgomery applied with meticulous care at El Alamein. Ultimately, the control of supply lines in the desert became a decisive factor in the North African campaign. It determined not only the range and speed of armored advances but also the sustainability of prolonged engagements, the morale of soldiers, and the resilience of defensive positions. While Rommel's tactical brilliance had repeatedly threatened Allied forces, it was the mastery of logistics, careful planning, and the ability to maintain secure supply chains that allowed the Eighth Army to hold the line and prepare for a decisive counteroffensive. The desert proved that wars are won as much by organization, foresight, and endurance as by valor and firepower. By ensuring that ammunition, fuel, water, and rations reached the front consistently, the Allies were able to withstand Rommel's assaults, exploit Axis weaknesses, and set the stage for the eventual turning point at El Alamein. The sands of North Africa, harsh and unyielding, had taught a fundamental lesson: in the desert, logistics is not merely support, it is the backbone of victory. As the blistering North African sun set over the dunes of El Alamein, a tense stillness fell across the battlefield. For weeks, the desert had been a theater of probing attacks, artillery duels, and armored skirmishes, each side testing the other's strength, resilience, and tactical acumen. Yet beneath the apparent calm, Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery was meticulously orchestrating the next phase of the campaign. Recognizing that Rommel's Axis forces had stretched themselves thin and that the desert itself favored well-prepared defenses, Montgomery began to reorganize the Eighth Army, focusing not only on immediate survival but on preparing for a decisive counteroffensive that could turn the tide in the Allies' favor. The first priority was strengthening artillery and armor units. Montgomery understood that in desert warfare, firepower and mobility were inseparable. Artillery placements were reviewed and repositioned to cover key approaches, particularly the narrow corridor between the Mediterranean coast and the Qatar Depression. These artillery positions were meticulously mapped to deliver maximum destructive potential while remaining protected from counter-battery fire. Tanks and armored brigades were reorganized into concentrated formations capable of both defensive firepower and rapid offensive thrusts. Engineers worked alongside logistics units to ensure fuel, ammunition, and water could reach these frontline units with reliability, mitigating one of the most persistent threats in desert operations, the fragility of supply lines. Intelligence played a pivotal role in shaping Montgomery's preparations. Signals intelligence, reconnaissance flights, and captured documents provided detailed insights into Axis deployments and vulnerabilities. Analysts identified sectors where Rommel had overextended his panzer divisions, pinpointed weaknesses in Italian infantry positions, and evaluated the availability of German artillery and reserves. This information allowed Montgomery to craft a multi-layered plan that would exploit enemy weaknesses while minimizing risk to Allied forces. Knowledge of Axis supply constraints also informed timing, ensuring that attacks would occur when enemy units were most vulnerable due to shortages of fuel or ammunition. Training and morale were equally critical components of Montgomery's preparation. Soldiers, acutely aware of the Desert Fox's reputation, were subjected to rigorous drills and exercises to ensure cohesion under fire. Infantry units practiced coordinated maneuvers with armored and artillery elements, simulating desert conditions to develop fluid communication and rapid responsiveness. Commanders emphasized discipline and teamwork, recognizing that the success of a large-scale offensive depended on each unit understanding its role and executing it flawlessly. Troops were also motivated through speeches, briefings, and the visible presence of Montgomery himself, whose calm and methodical demeanor instilled confidence and discipline across the ranks. Supply chains were reinforced to support the planned offensive. The desert's harsh conditions meant that even well-prepared troops could falter without water, fuel, and ammunition. Montgomery ensured that forward depots were stocked, that convoys were timed to arrive under cover of terrain or darkness when possible, and that engineers maintained roads to prevent vehicles from becoming bogged in sand or salt flats. This logistical foresight provided the backbone for the counteroffensive, ensuring that the Eighth Army could maintain momentum once the attack commenced. Coordination across Allied contingents added another layer of complexity. British, Australian, New Zealand, and South African units had to operate seamlessly together. Montgomery invested significant effort in ensuring that communication lines were clear, command structures were unified, and tactical doctrines were compatible across national contingents. By doing so, he transformed a diverse coalition into a cohesive fighting force capable of exploiting any breach in Axis lines and responding rapidly to unforeseen developments. Psychologically, Montgomery's preparation instilled a sense of inevitability among his troops. Soldiers were aware of the rigorous planning, intelligence support, and logistical backing underpinning the operation. This knowledge fostered confidence, allowing them to face Rommel's approaching armored columns with resolve rather than apprehension. The calm before the storm was, in reality, a period of intense preparation and mental conditioning, turning anticipation into a weapon in itself. Montgomery's meticulous organization extended beyond battlefield mechanics. He anticipated Axis reactions to the planned offensive, preparing contingencies for counterattacks, armored thrusts, and flanking maneuvers. Each brigade and division received detailed instructions, while artillery coordination ensured overlapping fields of fire that could quickly adapt to changing conditions. Reconnaissance units continued to monitor Axis positions, providing real-time updates to commanders and enabling flexibility within the overarching plan. This integration of planning, intelligence, logistics, and morale created a resilient and adaptable force capable of sustaining prolonged engagement in the desert's unforgiving environment. The calm that settled over El Alamein was therefore deceptive. While the desert seemed silent, every soldier, officer, and logistician was engaged in a critical task. Defensive positions were strengthened, offensive units were prepared, and the intelligence picture was continually refined. Montgomery's leadership ensured that the Eighth Army was not merely waiting for Rommel to act but was actively shaping the conditions of battle, ready to seize the initiative. By the time the Axis forces began their advance, the Eighth Army stood ready, well supplied, well coordinated, and motivated. The defensive line was robust, yet flexible enough to allow for counterattacks, while artillery and armor were positioned to deliver maximum impact. Soldiers understood their roles, officers understood theirs, and intelligence had illuminated the enemy's weaknesses. The desert, vast and unpredictable, had been studied, mapped, and leveraged to Allied advantage. Ultimately, the calm before the storm at El Alamein was a period of relentless preparation and strategic foresight. Montgomery transformed anticipation into a weapon, building an army capable of holding firm against Rommel's legendary offensives and then delivering a decisive counterblow. The coming storm would test every soldier's endurance, skill, and courage, but the Eighth Army's readiness turned what might have been a desperate defense into the foundation for a historic Allied victory in North Afrika. As the desert heat beat down on the sands of North Afrika, Rommel's forces advanced with characteristic speed and audacity, confident in their momentum. The Desert Fox, renowned for his bold tactics and rapid armored thrusts, pushed his units deep into the Allied front, seeking to break through the British lines and seize the strategic prize of Egypt. Yet, in his eagerness to capitalize on earlier victories, Rommel began to stretch his forces perilously thin, a miscalculation that would soon prove critical to the unfolding campaign. Rommel's rapid advance depended heavily on maintaining a delicate balance between offensive thrust and logistical support. Tanks, mechanized infantry, and artillery moved swiftly across hundreds of miles of desert, but each kilometer forward extended supply lines. Fuel, water, ammunition, and rations were required in increasing quantities, and the desert's harsh conditions magnified the strain. Sand-clogged engines, vehicles overheated in the blazing sun, and supply convoys became slow-moving targets, vulnerable to attack or mechanical breakdowns. The very speed that had allowed Rommel to outflank the Allies now risked overextension and isolation of forward units. Compounding these challenges, Rommel underestimated the strength and resilience of the Allied forces at El Alamein. Montgomery had transformed the Eighth Army into a cohesive and well-prepared defensive force. British and Commonwealth units held key positions, supported by carefully sighted artillery, anti-tank obstacles, and fortified strongpoints. Intelligence and reconnaissance provided precise information about Axis movements, allowing the Allies to anticipate flanking maneuvers and prepare countermeasures. Where Rommel expected hesitation and disorganization, he encountered discipline, coordination, and readiness, frustrating the Desert Fox's attempts to achieve rapid breakthroughs. The combination of overextension and environmental challenges left Rommel's forces vulnerable in multiple areas. Tanks operating far from supply depots risked running out of fuel at critical moments. Infantry units, dependent on regular resupply of food and water, suffered fatigue and reduced combat effectiveness. Artillery and machine guns, essential for suppressing enemy positions, sometimes lacked ammunition at the decisive moment. Every forward thrust, while tactically impressive, carried the strategic risk of isolation that Montgomery was prepared to exploit. Recognizing these vulnerabilities, Allied commanders began to identify opportunities for a counterattack. Concentrated reserves could be maneuvered to exploit gaps in Axis lines, and artillery could deliver concentrated fire against overextended armored columns. Reconnaissance reported weakened supply convoys, exposed flanks, and fatigued units, providing actionable intelligence for Montgomery's meticulous planning. In essence, Rommel's brilliance in execution became a double-edged sword. While his speed pressured the Allies, it simultaneously created openings that could be turned against him if the defenders acted with precision and cohesion. Axis overreach also had psychological consequences. Troops on the front lines, aware of the lengthening supply lines and growing distances from command, experienced increased stress and uncertainty. Communication difficulties hindered coordination between armored divisions and supporting infantry, while the constant desert sun and scarcity of water and food sapped morale. Conversely, Allied forces, confident in their defensive preparations and intelligence advantages, were emboldened to hold firm and prepare for decisive strikes. The desert itself compounded Axis miscalculations. The inhospitable environment punished mistakes, sandstorms reduced visibility, navigation errors led to disorientation, and extreme temperatures fatigued men and machinery alike. These conditions amplified the consequences of Rommel's stretched formations. Units that might have been effective in shorter, concentrated engagements found themselves thinly dispersed across terrain that magnified vulnerability. The desert acted as a natural force multiplier for the defenders, enhancing the impact of Allied artillery and defensive fire. Strategically, the stage was set for a decisive Allied response. Montgomery, observing the Axis deployment and analyzing intelligence reports, could identify points of pressure and weakness. He prepared reserves to exploit gaps, coordinated artillery concentrations to weaken forward positions, and ensured that armored units could maneuver to counter any sudden thrusts. The meticulous attention to logistics, timing, and combined arms meant that Rommel's overreach, once a tactical advantage, now exposed him to a coordinated, high-impact response. In summary, the early stages of the campaign at El Alamein highlighted the danger of overextension in desert warfare. Rommel's audacious advances showcased tactical genius and daring, yet the desert's harsh realities, coupled with the Eighth Army's preparedness, turned these strengths into vulnerabilities. Supply shortages, environmental hardships, and underestimated Allied resilience created openings that Montgomery could exploit. The concept of overreach, moving too far, too fast, with insufficient support, demonstrated that even the most brilliant commander could be undone if the terrain, logistics, and enemy readiness were not fully accounted for. Rommel's daring maneuvers, while initially threatening, became the catalyst for the Allies' carefully timed counteroffensive. By recognizing the limits of Axis mobility, the vulnerabilities of their stretched supply lines, and the fatigue of their troops, Montgomery positioned his forces to absorb the pressure, strike decisively, and ultimately turn the tide in the desert. The stage was now set for the climactic battles that would define El Alamein, where preparation, intelligence, and endurance would triumph over audacity and overreach. The sands of El Alamein trembled under the first echoes of artillery fire as Montgomery initiated the opening moves of his long-anticipated offensive. The desert, a vast and unforgiving expanse, became the stage for a meticulously planned strike aimed at testing, weakening, and ultimately breaking the Axis defenses. Months of preparation, intelligence gathering, and troop training culminated in these first blows, signaling the beginning of a battle that would determine the fate of North Africa. Montgomery's strategy began with a massive artillery bombardment. Hundreds of guns, positioned along the British defensive line, unleashed coordinated fire on Axis fortifications, gun emplacements, and supply depots. The goal was not merely to destroy enemy positions but to probe their strength, observe their reactions, and create openings for advancing infantry and armor. The bombardment sent plumes of sand and dust into the air, shrouding movements and sowing confusion among Rommel's forward units. For the Allies, the timing and concentration of fire reflected the culmination of painstaking planning, as artillery officers had calculated ranges, angles, and coordinated barrages to maximize disruption while minimizing wasted ammunition. Following the artillery preparatory fire, infantry units moved forward in probing attacks. These initial skirmishes were designed to test the Axis lines, gauge the resilience of enemy soldiers, and gather intelligence on defensive positions. Troops advanced cautiously through mined fields and across exposed desert stretches, using cover whenever possible and coordinating with artillery to suppress enemy fire. These probing attacks revealed both strengths and weaknesses in Rommel's deployment, informing commanders where the main thrusts of the forthcoming offensive could be most effective. Armored units played a complementary role in these opening actions. British and Commonwealth tanks moved in close support of infantry, ready to exploit breaches and provide heavy firepower against Axis bunkers and machine gun nests. Tank crews navigated the harsh desert terrain with precision, aware that mobility and speed were essential to avoid becoming stationary targets. These early armored engagements, though limited in scale, were crucial for testing enemy responsiveness and adjusting tactics for larger, decisive assaults. The Axis forces, under Rommel's command, responded with characteristic agility and determination. German and Italian units sought to repel the probing attacks, testing the coordination and firepower of their own armored divisions and artillery. Defensive positions were reinforced, machine gun nests and bunkers returned fire, and reserves were held in readiness to counter any breakthroughs. The Axis response revealed both their combat effectiveness and logistical vulnerabilities, highlighting areas where the Eighth Army could apply concentrated pressure in the days to come. Morale and leadership emerged as decisive factors in these first blows. For the Allied troops, seeing their artillery successfully disrupt enemy positions and witnessing coordinated infantry and tank movements bolstered confidence and faith in Montgomery's meticulous planning. Soldiers felt reassured that every aspect of the offensive had been carefully orchestrated, from supply lines to reconnaissance, allowing them to advance with measured determination. For the Axis, the initial attacks tested the resolve of frontline troops and the responsiveness of their commanders, exposing the strain of prolonged overextension and the challenges of desert combat. Logistics, as always in the desert, played a critical role. Artillery, armored units, and infantry required constant resupply of ammunition, fuel, and water. Forward supply depots were active, ensuring that frontline units could sustain pressure during the probing attacks. Engineers and logistics personnel worked tirelessly to maintain roads and routes through sand, salt flats, and rugged terrain, minimizing delays and ensuring operational continuity. The efficiency of these supply efforts allowed the Allies to maintain operational tempo, even in the face of enemy countermeasures. These first skirmishes also offered invaluable intelligence. Observations of Axis troop movements, artillery responsiveness, and armored coordination allowed Montgomery's staff to refine plans for the full-scale offensive. Reconnaissance units noted weaknesses, and signals intelligence provided updates on Axis communications and morale. By integrating real-time data with prior planning, the Allies could anticipate enemy reactions and adjust subsequent operations with precision. Ultimately, the first blows at El Alamein were both a demonstration of Allied preparation and a testing ground for Axis resilience. The initial bombardments and probing attacks achieved multiple objectives. They inflicted material damage, assessed enemy strength, revealed weaknesses, and bolstered troop confidence. For Rommel, these engagements underscored the challenges of defending against a methodically planned offensive while managing overstretched supply lines and the harsh desert environment. As dust and smoke settled over the desert, it was clear that the campaign had truly begun. Both sides had measured each other's strength, learned critical lessons, and prepared for the decisive engagement that would follow. The first blows were more than tactical maneuvers. They were a prelude to the climactic confrontation that would test strategy, endurance, and courage in one of the most iconic battles of the Second World War. In the desert of Alamein, the stage was set, the lines drawn, and the war of attrition and strategy was about to escalate into full-scale combat. The desert air vibrated with anticipation and tension as Montgomery gave the signal to commence the long-awaited 8th Army offensive at Alamein. Months of preparation, planning, and intelligence gathering had culminated in this moment, and the Allied forces were ready to strike. The first phase was a full-scale artillery barrage, meticulously coordinated to target the Axis defensive lines, disrupt enemy formations, and soften positions for the advancing infantry and armored units. The rumble of artillery echoed across the sands, sending plumes of sand and smoke into the sky and signaling that the Desert Fox would finally be challenged in a major, sustained engagement. British intelligence had played a crucial role in shaping the offensive. Reconnaissance reports, intercepted communications, and careful observation of German supply lines allowed Montgomery to pinpoint vulnerable sectors within the Axis defenses. Every shell fired was directed with purpose, aimed not just at destruction but at exploiting weaknesses, creating gaps, and forcing enemy troops to reveal their positions. The artillery bombardment also served a psychological function, testing the resolve of Rommel's soldiers while demonstrating the precision and coordination of the 8th Army to its own troops. As the barrage intensified, infantry and armored units moved forward, coordinating closely with artillery fire. British and Commonwealth soldiers advanced in carefully structured waves, keeping under the protective cover of smoke and shelling. Tanks maneuvered to exploit breaches and suppress fortified positions, while infantry cleared mines and obstacles, securing ground and preparing for the next phase of the attack. Each advance was a calculated measure, testing the Axis lines while minimizing exposure to enemy fire. The Axis forces, caught under the relentless bombardment, struggled to respond effectively. German and Italian units attempted to reorganize and mount counter-barrages, but the combination of continuous artillery fire, advancing troops, and pressure from multiple directions stretched their command and control capabilities. Communications were disrupted, reserves were delayed, and the desert terrain complicated rapid movement, exposing vulnerabilities in Rommel's deployment that Montgomery had anticipated. In these early movements, the effectiveness of the 8th Army's integrated approach became evident. Infantry, artillery, and armor operated as a cohesive whole, with each component supporting the others. Tanks provided mobile firepower to back infantry advances, while artillery suppressed key targets and disrupted enemy formations. Reconnaissance teams relayed real-time information to commanders, allowing adjustments in troop movements and artillery targeting. The combination of planning, intelligence, and coordination gave the Allies a decisive operational advantage, even before close-quarters combat had begun. Morale and leadership were pivotal as the hammer fell. Soldiers who had endured previous skirmishes and probing attacks now moved forward with renewed confidence, aware that the offensive had been meticulously planned to exploit enemy weaknesses. Officers ensured units maintained formation and discipline under fire, while signals teams kept lines of communication intact, allowing commanders to issue orders and adapt to rapidly changing battlefield conditions. This confidence translated into effective action, enabling the Allies to maintain pressure on Axis positions without succumbing to chaos or panic. The desert environment itself played a role in shaping the offensive. Open expanses allowed for visibility and artillery coordination, but also posed challenges for infantry and armor. Sand, heat, and uneven terrain required careful maneuvering, and supply lines had to be maintained across hundreds of miles. Logistics, often a limiting factor in desert campaigns, had been strengthened, ensuring fuel, ammunition, and water reached the front lines on schedule. Engineers maintained roads and cleared obstacles to prevent units from becoming immobilized under fire. By the end of the first day of Montgomery's offensive, early gains were evident. Infantry units had captured forward positions, armored brigades had neutralized enemy strongpoints, and artillery continued to pound defensive emplacements. Axis forces were forced to respond under continuous pressure, revealing weaknesses in coordination, communication, and troop endurance. The initial advances demonstrated the potential for a larger breakthrough, showing that a methodical, intelligence-driven approach could blunt the Desert Fox's previously unstoppable momentum. In summary, the first phase of the Allied offensive at El Alamein, the hammer falling upon Axis lines, combined artillery precision, coordinated infantry and armor movements, intelligence exploitation, and disciplined leadership. These early blows tested Rommel's defenses, exposed vulnerabilities, and set the stage for sustained offensive operations. The desert, once a theater of fluid maneuver, had become the backdrop for a calculated, deliberate strike, where preparation, foresight, and cohesion would dictate the pace of battle. Montgomery's hammer had fallen, and the Axis forces were now forced to respond under pressure, marking the true beginning of the decisive confrontation that would define the North African campaign. The North African desert, a vast and relentless expanse of sand, rock, and heat, had already witnessed weeks of maneuvering, probing attacks, and artillery duels. Yet, as the Allied offensive at El Alamein gathered momentum, it became clear that the battle for the desert would be decided by armored warfare. Tanks, both British and German, would dominate the landscape, turning sand dunes into arenas of mechanical thunder, smoke, and strategic cunning. Montgomery's carefully coordinated assault now relied heavily on the mobility, firepower, and coordination of armored divisions to break Axis defenses, exploit weaknesses, and secure the initiative in the desert theater. British armored divisions, reorganized and reinforced under Montgomery's command, advanced with meticulous planning. Tanks moved in concert with infantry and artillery, each unit supporting the other to maximize effectiveness. The desert terrain, however, was unforgiving. Loose sand sapped traction, sudden depressions and rocky outcrops threatened mobility, and visibility was often reduced by heat haze or dust clouds kicked up by moving vehicles. Engineers had worked tirelessly to improve roads and trackways, ensuring that armored units could maneuver efficiently without becoming bogged down or isolated. Every advance required careful navigation and coordination, as even a single tank immobilized in the desert could halt a formation and expose it to enemy fire. Rommel's panzer divisions, seasoned from months of desert campaigning, countered with characteristic skill and audacity. German armor relied on speed, concentration of fire, and flanking maneuvers to penetrate Allied lines. The Desert Fox was acutely aware of the British preparations and aimed to exploit any gap in the defensive formations. German crews were trained to operate in harsh conditions, coordinating closely with mechanized infantry and artillery units to deliver combined arms attacks. Their mobility allowed rapid strikes on weak points, threatening to collapse defensive positions before reserves could respond. Early skirmishes between the armored forces highlighted both the tactical importance of terrain and the challenges of desert warfare. British tank crews had to contend not only with German firepower but also with the shifting sands that slowed movement and masked obstacles. Likewise, supply limitations, fuel, ammunition, and water restricted the duration and intensity of engagements. Desert heat placed additional strain on engines and crews, making mechanical reliability as critical as tactical skill. Units had to operate with constant awareness of their surroundings, adapting to the unpredictable conditions that could turn the desert against even the most disciplined forces. Despite these challenges, British armored divisions began to achieve small tactical victories that boosted morale across the Eighth Army. Successful advances in key sectors allowed infantry to secure ground, artillery to bring concentrated fire on enemy positions, and observation units to relay critical information about Axis movements. Each successful engagement reinforced the confidence of Allied troops, demonstrating that Rommel's armored spearhead could be checked and that disciplined, coordinated action could exploit vulnerabilities. The battle also showcased the importance of combined arms coordination. Tanks were not merely mobile firepower, they served as shields for infantry, platforms for observation, and instruments for channeling enemy forces into kill zones. Artillery barrages were synchronized with tank movements, while reconnaissance units provided real-time intelligence on enemy dispositions. This integration allowed the Allies to maintain pressure, adapt to Rommel's maneuvers, and prepare for larger, decisive engagements that would follow in the coming days. Rommel, while experienced and formidable, now faced the consequences of overextended supply lines and thinly stretched formations. The desert, once his ally in enabling rapid advances, now amplified the vulnerabilities created by his audacious maneuvers. British armored resistance forced German units to slow, regroup, and contend with increasing attrition. The Desert Fox's famed mobility was constrained by the effective preparation and coordination of Montgomery's forces, demonstrating that even the most skillful commander could be challenged when supply, terrain, and intelligence worked against him. The psychological impact of these armored engagements was profound. For Allied troops, witnessing successful tank maneuvers under fire inspired confidence and reinforced the sense that the offensive could succeed. For Axis soldiers, sustained resistance and coordinated countermeasures introduced caution and fatigue, gradually eroding the momentum that Rommel had relied upon in his earlier campaigns. Leadership at all levels, tank commanders, brigade officers, and generals, became decisive, as real-time decisions could determine whether an engagement resulted in a breakthrough or a costly stalemate. By the end of the initial armored clashes, the British forces had demonstrated both resilience and adaptability. Tactical gains, though limited in scope, validated the meticulous preparation and integration of intelligence, logistics, and combined arms coordination. Tanks had not only engaged the enemy directly but had also shaped the battlefield, creating opportunities for infantry advances and artillery targeting. The desert, a theater of unpredictability and extremes, was being mastered through preparation, foresight, and disciplined execution. In conclusion, the armored clashes at El Alamein exemplified the critical interplay of strategy, mobility, and terrain in desert warfare. The British armored divisions, supported by artillery and infantry, tested Rommel's defenses, exploited vulnerabilities, and achieved incremental victories that cumulatively shifted momentum. These engagements underscored the importance of preparation, logistics, and integrated operations in modern warfare, demonstrating that in a vast desert, tactical skill and coordinated execution could overcome even the most audacious advances. The tanks in the sands were not just machines of war, they were instruments of strategy, shaping the battlefield and setting the stage for the decisive confrontations that would define the North African campaign. As the British forces pressed forward during the initial phases of the El Alamein offensive, Rommel recognized that inaction would cede initiative to Montgomery and risk unraveling months of meticulous preparation. The Desert Fox, renowned for his rapid thinking and tactical audacity, immediately began organizing localized counterattacks aimed at slowing the Allied advance, disrupting coordination, and buying time for reserves to reach critical sectors of the front. These countermeasures highlighted his ability to adapt under pressure, even while facing the cumulative strain of overextended supply lines and fatigue among his troops. Rommel's response relied on a careful combination of armor, mechanized infantry, and artillery. Tanks were deployed to conduct quick strikes against exposed Allied units, probing for weak points while attempting to draw enemy forces into pre-designated kill zones. Mechanized infantry moved in concert with these armored thrusts, securing flanks, reinforcing positions, and preventing Allied breakthroughs. Artillery batteries targeted advancing British formations, seeking to disrupt cohesion and inflict maximum attrition. This coordinated approach reflected Rommel's understanding that success depended not solely on individual daring, but on the synchronized application of firepower and maneuver. The desert terrain played a significant role in shaping both attack and defense. Open expanses allowed Rommel's panzers to maneuver rapidly, exploiting speed and positioning to engage vulnerable units. Yet, the same environment imposed limitations. Vehicles became prone to mechanical failures in the sand, and advancing columns could be isolated if overextended. Artillery and observation posts had to compensate for these constraints, adjusting firing patterns in real time based on reports from reconnaissance units. Despite these challenges, Rommel's skillful coordination enabled the Axis forces to deliver localized shocks, slowing British progress and compelling Montgomery to adjust his own deployment. For the British defenders, the counterattacks were a severe test of discipline and cohesion. Infantry and armored units had to maintain defensive positions under sudden and aggressive assaults, often in areas previously considered secure. British commanders relied heavily on pre-established strongpoints, overlapping fields of fire, and mobile reserves to absorb the pressure. Tanks supporting infantry were critical in repelling Rommel's advances, while artillery units responded with precision barrages to break up attacking formations. This adaptability allowed the Allies to withstand the intensity of Axis countermeasures without sacrificing momentum. The engagements during these counterattacks were intense and often chaotic. Small-scale armored duels erupted alongside infantry skirmishes, with each side attempting to exploit weaknesses in the other's formation. The Desert Fox's emphasis on rapid, flexible action meant that attacks could appear and vanish almost simultaneously, challenging Allied forces to maintain situational awareness and respond decisively. Observers noted that Rommel's forces often executed feints and deceptive maneuvers, creating confusion and forcing the British to spread their resources more thinly across the front. Beyond the tactical dimension, the psychological impact of Rommel's counterattacks was significant. For British soldiers, facing the Desert Fox's sudden strikes reinforced the ever-present danger of overextension, demanding constant vigilance and reinforcing the value of preparation and training. Conversely, Axis troops found renewed purpose in these operations. Despite the logistical strains and cumulative fatigue, successful localized engagements bolstered morale and maintained confidence in their commander's leadership. Montgomery, however, anticipated Rommel's responses. Intelligence from reconnaissance patrols and intercepted communications provided early warning of potential counterattacks, allowing British units to dig in, coordinate reserves, and position artillery effectively. The careful preparation ensured that while Axis assaults were fierce and skillfully executed, they failed to achieve strategic breakthroughs. British forces adapted dynamically, using the lessons of each counterattack to reinforce weak sectors and coordinate supporting fire. These localized clashes served as a learning ground for both armies. Rommel adjusted his tactics in real time, probing for weaknesses, redistributing forces, and attempting to exploit any hesitation among the Allies. Simultaneously, Montgomery's forces refined their defensive coordination, improving communication between infantry, armor, and artillery, and reinforcing areas under pressure. The result was a fluid, high-intensity exchange where adaptability, leadership, and preparation determined survivability as much as sheer firepower. In summary, Rommel's response at El Alamein, through counterattacks and tactical adaptation, demonstrated his ability to operate under pressure and leverage limited resources to delay and disrupt the Allied offensive. Coordinated armor and infantry maneuvers tested British positions, while the desert environment amplified both the challenges and opportunities of mobile warfare. The British, fortified by meticulous planning, intelligence, and cohesion, successfully absorbed these assaults, illustrating the importance of preparation and adaptability in modern combat. These early engagements set the tone for the larger, decisive battles that would define the North African campaign, proving that even the Desert Fox's brilliance could be met with methodical, disciplined resistance. The North African desert, with its endless sands and blistering sun, became both battlefield and adversary as the Eighth Army and Rommel's forces clashed in the opening phases of El Alamein. While artillery barrages, armored thrusts, and tactical maneuvers dominated the headlines, the relentless environment and attritional nature of desert warfare inflicted a toll as severe as any enemy fire. The early weeks of the campaign revealed that victory would depend not only on strategy and skill but also on endurance, resourcefulness, and the ability to withstand the punishing conditions of the desert. Both sides faced heavy casualties. In skirmishes and localized counterattacks, infantry units suffered from machine gun fire, artillery, and tank engagements. Each advance or defensive stand came at a cost, with soldiers killed or wounded while attempting to hold positions, probe enemy lines, or exploit tactical gaps. Armor units experienced similar losses. Tanks disabled by mines, shellfire, or mechanical failure contributed to an accumulating tally of vehicles removed from the battlefield. These losses were magnified by the challenges of recovering and repairing equipment in the vast desert expanse, where a single breakdown could remove a tank from action entirely. Environmental factors amplified the human toll. The desert's sun scorched exposed troops during the day, causing heat exhaustion, dehydration, and fatigue. Nights, by contrast, brought frigid temperatures, forcing soldiers to contend with hypothermia while maintaining alertness and readiness for potential enemy action. Sandstorms reduced visibility, clogged weapons, and hampered communications, adding an unpredictable and relentless layer of difficulty to each engagement. The desert itself became a constant, silent adversary, magnifying the effects of combat and making every movement and decision fraught with risk. Logistical challenges further exacerbated the attritional impact. Both the Allies and Axis forces required continuous resupply of water, fuel, food, and ammunition to maintain operational capability. Supply lines were stretched across hundreds of miles of open desert, vulnerable to interdiction, mechanical failure, and enemy fire. Delays or shortages had immediate consequences: tanks immobilized due to lack of fuel, artillery running low on shells, or infantry without sufficient rations and water. The strain on logistics increased physical and mental fatigue, reducing combat effectiveness and amplifying the attritional nature of the fighting. Troop morale and endurance were tested to their limits. Soldiers were required to march or maneuver long distances under extreme heat, sandstorms, and enemy fire. Sleep was scarce, and medical support limited. Wounds and illnesses compounded the stress of continuous engagement. Units had to maintain cohesion and discipline despite exhaustion, the loss of comrades, and the uncertainty of desert operations. Leadership at all levels played a crucial role in sustaining morale, with officers and NCOs providing guidance, encouragement, and practical solutions to keep units operational. Casualties were not confined to the immediate effects of combat. Desert conditions caused mechanical attrition, with vehicles breaking down under heat and sand abrasion, as well as physical ailments among soldiers, including sunstroke, dehydration, and heat-related illnesses. The cumulative effects of these factors meant that attrition was constant and inescapable, shaping the tempo of operations and the planning of future engagements. Montgomery and Rommel alike had to account for losses from both combat and environment when determining force dispositions and operational objectives. The impact of desert attrition extended beyond immediate tactical concerns to strategic planning. Montgomery recognized that sustainable operations required maintaining the health, strength, and supply of his forces, emphasizing reserves, rotation of units, and careful allocation of resources. Conversely, Rommel had to balance aggressive maneuvers with the limitations imposed by overextended lines and the physical toll on troops and vehicles. Each side's ability to endure the desert's demands influenced decisions on timing, offensive operations, and defensive fortifications. Despite the toll, small victories and tactical successes served as vital morale boosters. Securing a hill, repelling a counterattack, or advancing a few hundred meters of desert could renew confidence and reinforce the belief that disciplined, coordinated action could overcome both the enemy and the environment. These incremental gains, while modest in scale, demonstrated that preparation, training, and leadership could mitigate the destructive effects of attrition. In essence, the early stages of El Alamein were defined by desert attrition, where the combination of combat, environmental stress, and logistical challenges imposed relentless pressure on both armies. Success depended on more than tactical skill; it required endurance, adaptability, and careful management of resources and personnel. Soldiers faced not only enemy fire but the unforgiving conditions of sand, heat, and mechanical strain, highlighting the brutal reality of desert warfare. The lessons of attrition at El Alamein emphasized the interdependence of combat effectiveness, supply, and human resilience. Units that could maintain cohesion, manage resources efficiently, and adapt to environmental challenges had a distinct advantage. As Montgomery's forces absorbed the Axis pressure, withstood counterattacks, and leveraged small gains, the foundations were laid for a larger, decisive offensive. The desert had tested both sides mercilessly, but the ability to endure and adapt would ultimately determine who controlled the sands of North Afrika. The roar of artillery echoed across the endless North African desert as the El Alamein campaign entered a phase where firepower would become the decisive factor in shaping the battlefield. Both sides understood that control of terrain and the destruction of enemy formations relied not solely on maneuvering tanks or infantry assaults, but on the relentless pounding delivered by well-coordinated artillery units. In this vast and open theater, the artillery duel became a measure of both preparation and nerve, testing the resilience of defensive positions and the skill of those commanding the guns. For the British Eighth Army, under Montgomery's meticulous guidance, artillery was deployed with precision. Batteries were arranged in overlapping fields of fire, ensuring that any Axis advance would encounter a lethal curtain of shells before reaching forward positions. Forward observers, positioned on elevated dunes and ridges, relayed real-time information to gun crews, adjusting trajectories and targeting concentrations of enemy tanks, infantry, and fortifications. This integration of observation, communication, and firepower allowed the Allies to strike with both accuracy and devastating effect, disrupting Rommel's formations and inflicting significant attrition even before direct engagements occurred. The Axis forces, led by Rommel, were equally aware of the importance of artillery. German and Italian batteries engaged in counter-battery fire, attempting to suppress British guns and protect advancing units. Rommel's strategy relied on the mobility and speed of his panzer divisions, but this required that artillery support clear obstacles and neutralize defensive emplacements along the path of advance. The Axis also had to contend with the desert's challenges. Heat, dust, and uneven terrain affected targeting accuracy, while extended supply lines made it difficult to maintain sufficient ammunition for sustained exchanges. The artillery duels were grueling and continuous. Both sides fired thousands of rounds over days, with mortars, field guns, and heavy artillery exchanging salvos aimed at disrupting troop movements and destroying defensive positions. Smoke and sand were thrown high into the air, reducing visibility and complicating the battlefield's dynamics. Infantry and armor units advancing under this barrage had to navigate the landscape cautiously, using natural depressions and prepared cover to avoid casualties. The combination of destructive power and psychological pressure from constant bombardment tested the morale and endurance of every soldier on both sides. British coordination maximized the effectiveness of their artillery. Montgomery had ensured that units were well supplied, positioned strategically, and capable of rapid response to shifting threats. Pre-planned fire missions allowed batteries to concentrate on enemy strongpoints simultaneously, creating a shock effect that could halt or disorganize Axis advances. Forward observation officers continuously adjusted targeting based on Axis movements, ensuring that firepower was applied where it would have the greatest tactical impact. This careful orchestration transformed raw firepower into a strategic weapon capable of shaping the battlefield before tanks or infantry engaged directly. The Axis defenses began to show cracks under sustained bombardment. Repeated shelling damaged fortifications, disrupted supply lines, and inflicted casualties among frontline troops. Units attempting to maneuver through the desert faced artillery fire at every step, forcing Rommel to divert resources to protect vulnerable formations. The intensity of the barrage slowed German advances, eroded morale, and highlighted the growing effectiveness of Allied preparation. Even the Desert Fox, known for his adaptability, had to contend with the cumulative effects of concentrated artillery fire weakening his defenses before the full weight of British armored and infantry assaults arrived. These duels also had a psychological dimension. The incessant thudding of shells created an environment of fear and stress, impacting decision-making and endurance. Soldiers on both sides had to contend with the threat of sudden destruction, the noise and shockwaves shaking nerves, and the uncertainty of where the next strike would land. For the Allies, witnessing the success of their artillery in disrupting enemy formations reinforced confidence and validated months of meticulous planning. For Axis troops, the barrages underscored the peril of overextended positions and the vulnerability created by thinly held lines. Tactically, artillery duels allowed Montgomery to shape the battlefield, guiding where infantry and armor would advance and where reserves should be deployed. By softening enemy positions and exposing weaknesses, artillery created opportunities for localized breakthroughs and minimized risks to advancing troops. The interplay of firepower and maneuver demonstrated that modern warfare required not only courage and numbers but the precise orchestration of multiple arms working in unison. In essence, the artillery exchanges at El Alamein were decisive in setting the stage for the larger battle. British coordination, careful targeting, and sustained barrages tested Axis defenses, inflicted material and psychological damage, and revealed vulnerabilities that could be exploited in subsequent attacks. The desert, with its open expanses and unforgiving conditions, amplified the effects of artillery, proving that firepower, when expertly applied, could dominate and dictate the rhythm of battle. Through these duels, the Allies demonstrated the power of preparation, observation, and tactical integration, using artillery not merely as a weapon of destruction but as a tool to shape outcomes and set conditions for victory. The Axis, despite skill and experience, faced the limits imposed by logistics, terrain, and concentrated fire. The first sustained artillery exchanges at El Alamein revealed that in desert warfare, as in all combat, knowledge, coordination, and firepower together could turn the tide, even against a commander as formidable as Rommel. The deserts of North Africa stretched endlessly under a blazing sun, but amid the seemingly boundless sands, certain geographic features held outsized strategic importance. Among these, the coastal corridor along the Mediterranean Sea emerged as a vital lifeline for supply, reinforcement, and maneuver during the El Alamein campaign. Control of this narrow strip of terrain meant the difference between sustaining an army or facing immobilization, and both sides recognized that dominance here could dictate the pace and outcome of the entire battle. For the Allies, securing the coastal corridor was a top priority. The route allowed trucks and convoys to deliver fuel, ammunition, food, and medical supplies to frontline units, ensuring that infantry, armor, and artillery could operate effectively in the harsh desert conditions. Engineers worked tirelessly to maintain and improve roads, clear obstacles, and ensure that supply lines remained uninterrupted despite enemy action. Forward observation posts were established to monitor Axis movements, and artillery positions were carefully selected to protect convoys in key junctions. The British understood that the corridor was not merely a path of convenience, it was a lifeline for sustaining combat operations, providing the material support necessary for offensive momentum. Rommel, fully aware of the corridor's importance, sought to defend it at all costs. His forces deployed mechanized units, artillery, and fortified positions along critical junctions, attempting to block Allied movement and protect his supply lines. The Desert Fox aimed to exploit the corridor as a staging ground for both defensive operations and counterattacks, recognizing that control of the coastal route would allow flexibility in maneuvering his armored divisions and resupplying forward elements. Axis attempts to hold the corridor were fiercely contested, as both sides realized that the control of these few hundred meters could determine operational success or failure. Tactical engagements along the coastal corridor were intense and continuous. Small-scale skirmishes, artillery exchanges, and armored probes tested the defensive preparations on both sides. British units, leveraging intelligence and reconnaissance, carefully timed their attacks to weaken enemy positions while minimizing exposure to fire. Tanks and infantry worked in close coordination, securing key junctions, clearing minefields, and establishing strongpoints that could be reinforced rapidly. Every gain along the corridor allowed additional forces and supplies to flow forward, amplifying the momentum of the British advance. The corridor's significance extended beyond logistics. Control of the coastal route restricted Axis options, limiting the maneuverability of armored units and constraining Rommel's ability to exploit gaps or reinforce threatened sectors. Each successful Allied foothold forced German units to commit resources defensively, reducing the flexibility and speed that had previously characterized the Desert Fox's tactics. The interplay between territorial control and operational capability underscored the broader strategic importance of even narrow strips of terrain in the context of desert warfare. Environmental challenges further complicated operations along the corridor. The desert heat, shifting sands, and occasional coastal fog affected vehicle movement and visibility. Convoys required careful navigation to avoid becoming bogged down or exposed to artillery fire. Engineers continually reinforced roadways and established alternate routes, ensuring that logistical support could be maintained under continuous pressure. These measures allowed the British to sustain operations across extended lines, keeping armored and infantry units supplied and ready for action despite the harsh conditions. The human element was equally critical. Drivers, engineers, and soldiers maintaining the corridor faced constant danger from enemy fire and environmental hazards. Coordination between supply, reconnaissance, and combat units was essential to prevent bottlenecks or vulnerabilities that could be exploited by Axis forces. Soldiers understood that control of the corridor not only facilitated resupply but also provided a psychological advantage, reinforcing confidence in the ability to maintain pressure on the enemy while minimizing the risk of isolation or collapse. By mid-phase operations, British forces had secured key positions along the coastal corridor, creating a secure avenue for reinforcement and resupply. Artillery and observation units monitored Axis activity, preventing surprise attacks and ensuring that supplies reached forward units efficiently. These footholds enabled the Allies to plan and execute larger offensives, coordinating infantry, armor, and artillery with the assurance that the lifeline of the desert front was protected. Rommel's forces, despite skill and experience, struggled to contest the corridor effectively. Overextended units, compounded by supply shortages and the pressure of continuous bombardment, were increasingly vulnerable. Attempts to counterattack or disrupt British control met with stiff resistance, highlighting the growing effectiveness of Allied planning, coordination, and execution. The strategic initiative was gradually shifting, with the British consolidating advantages that would prove decisive in the battles to come. In summary, the focus on the coastal corridor during the El Alamein campaign exemplified the intersection of strategy, logistics, and terrain in desert warfare. Control of this critical route allowed the Allies to maintain supplies, reinforce troops, and coordinate large-scale operations while restricting Axis mobility and options. Tactical victories along the corridor translated into operational leverage, enabling Montgomery to dictate the pace of the offensive. The desert, while harsh and unforgiving, became a theater where careful preparation, disciplined execution, and the protection of vital supply routes determined the outcome of one of the most significant campaigns of the Second World War. As darkness descended over the desert, the seemingly endless expanse of sand became a stage for a new dimension of warfare, night operations designed to harass, disrupt, and demoralize. British forces, aware of the Axis dependence on extended supply lines and forward positions, employed commandos, artillery, and small-scale bombing raids to strike where Rommel least expected. These nocturnal engagements were not aimed at decisive breakthroughs, rather, their purpose was to erode morale, strain logistics, and create uncertainty within the Axis ranks. British commandos moved stealthily through the night, targeting key supply convoys, fuel depots, and artillery positions. Small teams conducted raids that destroyed vehicles, damaged infrastructure, and left the enemy scrambling to repair or reroute essential resources. Every successful strike disrupted Rommel's carefully orchestrated lines, forcing the Axis to divert manpower and attention to rear area security. These operations, though limited in scale, had outsized effects on operational efficiency, delaying reinforcements and reducing the tempo of Axis maneuvers. Complementing the commando actions were nighttime artillery and bombing raids. British artillery crews, positioned on elevated desert ridges, fired pre-planned barrages on German assembly areas, supply dumps, and known encampments. Coordination with reconnaissance allowed these barrages to be precise, targeting critical nodes that disrupted movement and depleted ammunition stocks. RAF bombers occasionally joined the effort, striking supply depots and transport columns under the cover of darkness. While the tonnage of ordnance dropped was relatively small compared to daylight battles, the psychological impact was significant. Axis troops endured sleepless nights, constant threat, and the anxiety of attacks that could strike anywhere along their lines. The psychological dimension of these night raids was profound. Soldiers faced the constant tension of uncertainty, knowing that an attack could come without warning. The inability to predict when or where British forces might strike created stress, reduced sleep, and eroded confidence. Even units that were physically unharmed experienced heightened fear and apprehension, affecting decision-making and overall effectiveness. Rommel, a master of offensive maneuver, found that the enemy now threatened not only his forward lines but also his rear areas, stretching his attention and resources in multiple directions simultaneously. From a logistical standpoint, night raids exacerbated the challenges of desert warfare. Disrupted supply convoys delayed fuel, water, and ammunition to frontline units, forcing Rommel to adjust plans and redistribute resources. Vehicles damaged or destroyed during these operations created gaps in mobility, while troops had to remain on high alert, further taxing endurance. The cumulative effect was a strain on both personnel and equipment, highlighting the vulnerability inherent in extended supply lines across harsh desert terrain. These nighttime operations also demonstrated the importance of initiative and adaptability. British forces leveraged intelligence from reconnaissance and prior engagements to choose targets that would yield maximum disruption with minimal exposure. Commandos adapted their routes to avoid detection, while artillery and bomber crews timed attacks to coincide with peak vulnerability. The combination of precision strikes, surprise, and psychological pressure allowed the Allies to influence the battle continuously, even when not engaged in large-scale daylight operations. Rommel attempted countermeasures, deploying patrols, fortifying supply routes, and setting up flares and observation posts to detect incursions. However, the sheer scale of the desert, combined with British agility and knowledge of the terrain, made complete protection impossible. Axis forces remained vulnerable to these raids, and the cumulative stress on morale and readiness began to tell, subtly weakening the effectiveness of Rommel's units and slowing the tempo of their operations. The nighttime harassment also had a strategic effect. By forcing the Axis to split attention and resources, Montgomery ensured that daytime engagements could proceed under more favorable conditions. The continuous pressure of raids and artillery fire compounded the physical and psychological attrition Rommel's forces faced, setting the stage for a decisive counteroffensive. Small tactical gains during the night translated into larger operational advantages by daylight, demonstrating how sustained harassment could amplify the impact of conventional attacks. In essence, the night raids at El Alamein represented a fusion of guerrilla tactics, artillery precision, and psychological warfare. British commandos, artillery units, and bombers disrupted Axis logistics, diminished morale, and created constant uncertainty, compelling Rommel to defend not only against frontal assaults but also against unpredictable threats from behind his lines. These operations exemplified how continuous pressure, even without large-scale engagement, could shape battlefield dynamics, weakening a formidable opponent before the main offensive strikes. By the end of the first phase of night raids, the British had achieved more than just physical damage, they had shifted the psychological balance in the desert. Axis units were on edge, supply lines were strained, and the Desert Fox faced an increasingly complex and hostile operational environment. The stage was set for Montgomery's next moves, the coordination of armored thrusts, infantry advances, and artillery barrages designed to exploit the vulnerabilities exposed by persistent harassment. In the vast, unforgiving desert, the night had become a powerful weapon, silent, unpredictable, and devastating in its cumulative effect. By the time the Eighth Army had pressed its offensive into the sands of El Alamein, signs that the Desert Fox's famed brilliance might be faltering had become increasingly evident. Rommel's forces, once the embodiment of rapid maneuver and audacious tactics, were now grappling with the cumulative effects of overextension, attrition, and desert conditions. The desert, which had previously favored the fast-moving panzer divisions, now amplified vulnerabilities that Montgomery was keen to exploit. The most immediate challenge for the Axis was overextended supply lines. As Rommel's armored and mechanized units had advanced deep into Egyptian territory, the distance from supply depots and rear area support became critical. Fuel shortages slowed tank movements, and ammunition sometimes failed to arrive at forward positions on time, reducing the combat effectiveness of both armored and infantry units. Water and food scarcity compounded the problem, straining morale and reducing physical endurance. These logistical constraints limited the Desert Fox's options, forcing him to conserve resources and preventing rapid responses to Allied maneuvers. Attrition had also taken a heavy toll. Continuous engagements, artillery bombardments, and the constant threat of night raids sapped manpower and equipment. Both officers and enlisted men were fatigued, reducing operational cohesion. Tanks and vehicles, subjected to desert heat, sand, and mechanical wear, broke down at critical moments, leaving units vulnerable to Allied artillery and counterattacks. Losses of experienced crews further degraded effectiveness, as replacements lacked the tactical training and battlefield familiarity that Rommel's original formations had possessed. The human element was equally critical. Axis troops exhibited signs of psychological exhaustion, increased hesitation under fire, slower reactions, and lapses in discipline. Desert heat, combined with the stresses of constant engagement and extended marches, created conditions in which even small setbacks could ripple into significant operational vulnerabilities. Montgomery's reconnaissance units and intelligence officers were quick to observe these indicators, noting gaps in lines, diminished counterattack capacity, and declining morale among both German and Italian forces. Montgomery, ever methodical, recognized that these weaknesses represented an opportunity for decisive breakthroughs. Careful analysis of reconnaissance reports, captured documents, and aerial surveillance allowed Allied commanders to pinpoint sectors where Axis defenses were thinnest or most fatigued. By concentrating artillery, armor, and infantry in these areas, the Eighth Army could exploit vulnerabilities created not by direct assault alone, but by the cumulative strain of prolonged desert operations. Tactical engagements further revealed the Axis's declining cohesion. Counterattacks were less coordinated, and responses to British probes were delayed or poorly executed. Communication breakdowns between panzer divisions and supporting infantry made rapid repositioning difficult, and the desert terrain amplified these shortcomings. Forward positions, once resilient under Rommel's tactical genius, now showed gaps where artillery strikes and infantry pressure could achieve local superiority. The combination of overextension, attrition, and environmental stressors created a strategic advantage for Montgomery. By maintaining pressure through sustained artillery barrages, coordinated armored movements, and tactical night raids, the Eighth Army gradually eroded Axis capability. Each skirmish revealed additional weaknesses, allowing British forces to adapt and concentrate forces where they could achieve the greatest effect. Morale among Allied troops benefited from these developments. Witnessing the Axis struggle to respond effectively reinforced confidence in leadership and strategy. Soldiers understood that their preparation, discipline, and cohesion were now yielding tangible results on the battlefield. Conversely, Axis troops faced the dual burden of physical exhaustion and psychological stress, knowing that the Allies were increasingly exploiting their weaknesses. In the broader operational picture, these developments set the stage for planned counteroffensives. Montgomery could design operations that leveraged gaps in Axis lines, integrating infantry advances with armor thrusts and artillery concentrations. The apparent faltering of the Desert Fox was not merely a tactical phenomenon, it was an operational opening that, if exploited decisively, could shift momentum irreversibly in favor of the Allies. Ultimately, the faltering of Rommel's forces at El Alamein highlighted the interplay of logistics, attrition, terrain, and human endurance in desert warfare. Even a commander as brilliant as the Desert Fox was vulnerable to overextension and cumulative stress on men and machines. Montgomery's keen observation and methodical planning ensured that these weaknesses did not go unexploited. The desert, harsh and unyielding, revealed that endurance, preparation, and coordinated strategy could outmatch audacity when the scales tipped against exhaustion and stretched resources. The stage was set for the decisive breakthroughs that would define the battle. The Desert Fox's aura of invincibility had been challenged not only by firepower and maneuver but also by the unrelenting pressures of logistics, attrition, and the desert itself. For Montgomery and the Eighth Army, recognizing and exploiting these signs of Axis weakness was the key to turning careful planning into strategic victory, paving the way for the climactic confrontations that would determine the outcome of North Africa. As the relentless desert sun cast its searing light across the sands of Alamein, the Eighth Army began to capitalize on the vulnerabilities exposed in Rommel's overextended lines. The meticulous preparation, coordinated attacks, and sustained pressure implemented by Montgomery and his commanders were beginning to bear fruit. Allied momentum was building steadily, signaling a shift in the balance of power that would define the North African campaign. British forces, having secured key positions along the coastal corridor and across the desert front, now consolidated their gains. Defensive strongpoints were reinforced, supply lines were stabilized, and reserves were repositioned to exploit weak sectors in the Axis lines. Every captured hill, ridge, or outpost served as both a tactical advantage and a launch point for further attacks, allowing the Allies to maintain operational tempo while denying Rommel the ability to regroup effectively. Central to the consolidation was the coordination between artillery, armor, and infantry. Artillery continued to pound Axis positions, creating gaps and disrupting German and Italian formations. Forward observers adjusted targeting in real time, ensuring that shelling was not only destructive but also strategically focused on weak points and concentrations of enemy troops. Armored divisions, moving in support of advancing infantry, exploited these openings to penetrate defensive lines, outflank strongpoints, and engage retreating units. Infantry, in turn, secured territory and neutralized pockets of resistance, ensuring that gains were held and expanded. The integration of these elements allowed the Eighth Army to maintain continuous pressure, forcing Axis forces into reactive rather than proactive operations. Rommel's defensive positions began to show signs of strain under this sustained pressure. Repeated artillery strikes and probing attacks eroded fortifications, inflicted casualties, and disrupted command and control within German and Italian units. Supply shortages compounded the problem, tanks ran low on fuel, ammunition depots were targeted, and fatigued infantry struggled to maintain cohesion in the face of relentless bombardment. The Desert Fox's ability to execute counterattacks was diminished, as reserves were delayed or insufficient to respond effectively to multiple points of Allied pressure. The psychological impact of this shifting momentum was significant. Allied troops, seeing tangible results from weeks of preparation, gained confidence and initiative. Morale rose as soldiers recognized that their coordinated efforts were translating into measurable progress. Conversely, Axis soldiers faced mounting stress and uncertainty. The repeated loss of ground, coupled with relentless artillery fire and the threat of armored breakthroughs, eroded confidence and amplified the effects of fatigue and attrition. Intelligence and reconnaissance played a crucial role in sustaining this momentum. Reports from forward observers, scouts, and intercepted communications allowed Montgomery to adapt tactics dynamically, concentrating forces where the Axis were weakest and redirecting attacks to exploit emerging opportunities. This real-time integration of information into operational planning ensured that the Allies maintained the initiative, continuously pressing Rommel into defensive actions rather than allowing him freedom of maneuver. Tactically, the advancing forces combined methodical pressure with calculated exploitation. British artillery would soften an enemy sector, followed by armored advances to breach the line, while infantry moved to secure flanks and prevent counterattacks. Reserves were poised to reinforce gains or exploit breakthroughs, creating a cycle of attrition and momentum that increasingly favored the Allies. Each successive engagement weakened Axis cohesion, making it more difficult for Rommel to stabilize defensive lines and execute tactical withdrawals without significant losses. The desert terrain, which had initially posed challenges to mobility and logistics, now favored those who could sustain coordinated, continuous operations. British engineers ensured roads and routes remained passable, enabling tanks, artillery, and supply convoys to move effectively across the battlefield. reconnaissance units provided early warnings of German movements, allowing Allied forces to react with precision rather than urgency, further compounding Axis difficulties. As the days progressed, the combination of physical pressure, attritional losses, and psychological strain began to shift the strategic balance decisively. Allied forces achieved repeated successes, capturing forward positions, neutralizing defensive emplacements, and forcing Axis troops to retreat or abandon key terrain. Rommel, constrained by overextended lines, dwindling reserves, and the relentless coordination of the Eighth Army, faced the harsh reality that his previously fluid and formidable defensive positions were now under systematic and unrelenting assault. By consolidating gains and pressing forward with coordinated attacks, the British forces created a momentum that was increasingly difficult for Axis forces to resist. The desert, once a domain where Rommel's mobility and audacity had dominated, now became a landscape shaped by meticulous planning, sustained pressure, and tactical discipline. Artillery, armor, and infantry functioned as a single, cohesive instrument of war, delivering repeated blows that systematically degraded enemy strength and morale. In conclusion, the stage was set for the decisive climax of the El Alamein campaign. The Allies' ability to consolidate gains, maintain continuous pressure, and exploit Axis weaknesses demonstrated that careful preparation, coordination, and adaptation could overcome even the most skilled adversary. The tide had turned, momentum now rested firmly with Montgomery and the Eighth Army, leaving Rommel struggling to hold his lines under the cumulative effects of attrition, overstretch, and the relentless advance of a well-coordinated foe. The desert sands had been contested fiercely, but now, the British were driving the battle toward a tipping point that would reshape the course of the North African campaign. As the Battle of El Alamein entered its climactic stages, Allied commanders focused on preparations for the decisive blow that could shatter Axis resistance and determine the fate of North Africa. Months of reconnaissance, intelligence gathering, and incremental advances had revealed critical weaknesses in Rommel's overstretched lines, while sustained pressure had eroded both the cohesion and morale of Axis forces. Now, Montgomery and his staff sought to synchronize all elements of the Eighth Army, ensuring that artillery, armor, infantry, and air support would operate in unison to deliver a final, overwhelming strike. The first step in preparation was reinforcing key sectors of the front. Fresh infantry divisions were rotated to relieve exhausted units, while experienced brigades were repositioned to exploit weaknesses in Axis defenses. Armored regiments were concentrated, with attention paid to ensuring adequate fuel, ammunition, and maintenance support. Artillery units were carefully calibrated, with fire plans pre-assigned to target enemy strongpoints, supply dumps, and likely avenues of counterattack. This careful orchestration aimed to prevent Rommel from responding effectively, allowing Allied forces to strike with concentrated and coordinated power. Intelligence played a pivotal role in shaping the offensive. Reconnaissance patrols, signals intelligence, and aerial observation had mapped out enemy positions in detail, highlighting gaps, weak points, and overstretched units. Montgomery's staff analyzed these data meticulously, designing attack routes that would maximize surprise, exploit exposed flanks, and reduce unnecessary casualties. By integrating information from multiple sources, the Allies could predict likely German responses and plan contingencies, turning knowledge into a strategic weapon. Troop morale was another crucial factor in preparing for the final assault. Soldiers, who had endured weeks of intense combat, desert heat, and attrition, were briefed on the overall plan and reassured of support. The careful rotation of units, coupled with visible artillery preparation and air support, instilled confidence that victory was achievable. Officers emphasized discipline, cohesion, and timing, ensuring that every man understood his role and the broader operational objectives. Logistics were a critical element in setting the stage for the final blow. Supplies, fuel, and ammunition were stockpiled and positioned close to the front, while engineers worked to clear obstacles and maintain routes for rapid movement. Tanks and armored vehicles were inspected and serviced, artillery crews rehearsed firing schedules, and infantry units practiced coordinated advances with supporting fire. This attention to detail ensured that the Eighth Army could execute its plan without disruption, maintaining the momentum and intensity necessary to overwhelm Axis defenses. The integration of air power further enhanced preparations. RAF squadrons conducted pre-assault reconnaissance, targeted enemy artillery and supply positions, and prepared to provide close air support during the offensive. Coordination between air and ground units was meticulously planned to avoid friendly fire and ensure maximum effectiveness. The presence of air superiority allowed Montgomery to concentrate forces and maneuver without fear of significant interference from Axis aircraft, reinforcing confidence among the troops. The desert itself became a carefully managed battlefield. Observation posts and scouts monitored terrain, identifying natural cover, elevation, and obstacles that could be exploited during the assault. Engineers prepared routes for tanks and infantry, ensuring that sand, dunes, and rocky outcrops would not hinder movement. By understanding and manipulating the desert environment, the Allies could leverage their numerical and tactical advantages while minimizing vulnerabilities. As all elements converged, reinforced troops, coordinated artillery, armored columns, and air support, the stage was set for the climactic engagement. British and Commonwealth soldiers, aware of the Axis overextension and the weakening defensive cohesion, prepared to deliver a blow that would not only push Rommel back but potentially decisively shift the momentum of the North African campaign. The careful orchestration of resources, intelligence, and planning reflected Montgomery's methodical approach, designed to leave nothing to chance. In essence, the preparations for the final blow at El Alamein demonstrated the art of modern combined arms warfare. Success depended on more than individual courage or local victories. It required the synchronization of every element of the fighting force, precise logistical support, and the exploitation of detailed intelligence. The meticulous groundwork laid by Montgomery and his staff transformed the battlefield from a contest of attrition into an arena where decisive action could achieve strategic results. By the dawn of the offensive, the Eighth Army stood ready. Every gun was primed, every tank crew briefed, and every infantry unit aware of its objective. The desert had already tested endurance, skill, and willpower, but now it would witness a concentrated strike designed to break Axis defenses and secure victory. The final phase of the battle was imminent, and the stage set by these preparations would determine not only the outcome of El Alamein but the broader course of the North African campaign and, ultimately, the Second World War itself. As the first light of dawn broke over the desert at El Alamein, the Eighth Army, meticulously arrayed under Montgomery's command, launched the great assault that had been weeks in preparation. Every unit, from artillery batteries to armored brigades and infantry battalions, moved in precise coordination, reflecting the culmination of intelligence, planning, and training. The goal was clear: exploit Axis weaknesses, break Rommel's overstretched defensive lines, and seize the initiative decisively in the North African theater. The offensive began with a massive artillery bombardment, designed to soften enemy positions and disrupt command and control. Hundreds of guns fired in unison, targeting fortified emplacements, artillery positions, and key junctions along the Axis front. Observers in forward positions relayed real-time adjustments, ensuring that fire was concentrated where it could inflict maximum disruption. Plumes of sand, smoke, and dust rose across the battlefield, masking the movement of advancing British and Commonwealth units while sowing confusion among German and Italian defenders. Following the artillery preparation, armored divisions advanced in concert with infantry units, moving through gaps created by the bombardment. Tanks engaged enemy strongpoints, suppressed machine gun nests, and provided mobile firepower to support the infantry's push forward. Engineers cleared obstacles, repaired tracks, and ensured that mobility was maintained, allowing armored columns to exploit breakthroughs rapidly. Infantry units advanced under this protective umbrella, consolidating gains and securing terrain for follow-on operations. The combined arms approach was critical to the initial success. Artillery, armor, and infantry did not operate independently, each element reinforced the other. Tanks shielded advancing infantry while engaging enemy armor, artillery targeted positions that threatened movement, and infantry secured terrain to prevent counterattacks. This integration allowed the Allies to apply sustained pressure across multiple points, overwhelming Axis defenders who were already stretched thin and suffering from attrition, fatigue, and logistical constraints. Axis forces responded with fierce determination. German and Italian units mounted counterattacks wherever possible, attempting to plug gaps, slow advances, and inflict casualties. However, Rommel's forces were constrained by overextended supply lines and diminished reserves. Artillery support was limited, armored units were dispersed, and infantry morale was weakening under the relentless pressure of the coordinated assault. The initial Allied gains further exposed vulnerabilities, forcing the Desert Fox to react under increasingly unfavorable conditions. The first phase of the offensive demonstrated the importance of preparation, intelligence, and timing. Allied units advanced in a manner that maximized the effects of prior reconnaissance and captured intelligence, ensuring that attacks struck where Axis positions were weakest. The synchronized movement of tanks and infantry, combined with concentrated artillery fire, allowed the British to maintain momentum while minimizing unnecessary exposure to enemy fire. Each success, however small, reinforced morale across the Eighth Army and signaled that the long-awaited turning point in the campaign had begun. Tactically, the offensive exploited both physical and psychological pressures. German soldiers, already fatigued and facing shortages of fuel and ammunition, were forced to contend with an adversary who coordinated attacks seamlessly across the front. The constant pressure, coupled with precise targeting and coordinated movement, created confusion and disarray within Axis ranks. Commanders struggled to reposition forces and maintain cohesion, while frontline units became increasingly vulnerable to follow-on assaults. The desert terrain, while challenging, provided advantages for the attackers. Open expanses allowed for rapid armored maneuvering, while carefully prepared supply routes enabled British units to sustain advances and rotate forces efficiently. Reconnaissance and observation posts continually fed information back to command, allowing adjustments in tactics and targeting to respond to Axis movements. These measures ensured that the initial gains were consolidated and prepared the way for deeper penetration into enemy lines. Psychologically, the assault had a profound effect on both sides. For Allied troops, witnessing the success of the coordinated attacks reinforced confidence in leadership, strategy, and their own abilities. Soldiers felt the cumulative benefits of careful planning, effective communication, and combined arms execution. For Axis defenders, the sustained pressure and visible loss of positions heightened stress, reduced morale, and eroded confidence in Rommel's ability to respond effectively. By the end of the first day, the initial gains signaled a turning point in the battle. Forward positions were captured, breaches were established, and the Axis defensive line began to show signs of fragmentation. The careful orchestration of artillery, armor, and infantry allowed the Allies to maintain pressure, dictate the pace of combat, and prepare for subsequent operations that would deepen the impact of the offensive. In conclusion, the Great Assault at El Alamein represented the culmination of preparation, intelligence, and coordination. It was more than a simple attack, it was a demonstration of combined arms warfare at its finest, exploiting weaknesses in the enemy's lines while maintaining cohesion and momentum. The initial successes not only inflicted material losses and disrupted Axis defenses but also shifted the strategic initiative firmly into Allied hands. The desert, once dominated by Rommel's swift maneuvers, now bore witness to the rising tide of the Eighth Army, setting the stage for decisive breakthroughs and the ultimate turning of the North African campaign in favor of the Allies. As the Eighth Army pressed its momentum following the initial Allied assaults at El Alamein, Rommel understood that the survival of his forces depended on immediate and desperate defensive measures. The Desert Fox, known for his audacious tactics and rapid maneuvers, now faced the stark reality of attrition, stretched supply lines, and the overwhelming coordination of British forces. In response, he orchestrated counterattacks designed to delay, disrupt, and buy time, aiming to stabilize critical positions and prevent a complete breakthrough. Axis armored units, comprising the veteran panzer divisions, were deployed to key sectors along the defensive line. Tanks maneuvered to intercept advancing British armored columns, exploiting terrain features such as ridges, depressions, and sand dunes to maximize both cover and firepower. Mechanized infantry worked in conjunction, reinforcing tanks, holding captured positions, and countering British attempts to exploit gaps in the line. Artillery units provided supporting fire, targeting concentrations of Allied troops and armor in an effort to blunt advances and inflict attritional losses. The fighting was relentless and chaotic. British forces, aware of Rommel's propensity for rapid countermeasures, advanced cautiously but aggressively, coordinating armor, infantry, and artillery in combined operations. The desert terrain, which had previously favored mobility and maneuver, now created choke points where intense engagements erupted. Tanks and infantry clashed at close quarters, artillery barrages interspersed with machine gun and rifle fire, producing a cacophony of destruction that tested the endurance of both men and machines. Despite these desperate measures, Axis cohesion began to show significant strain. Continuous engagement, attrition, and logistical limitations eroded the effectiveness of counterattacks. Fuel shortages, depleted ammunition, and damaged vehicles limited the ability to mount sustained resistance. Officers struggled to maintain command and control across fragmented units, while communication breakdowns hampered coordinated responses. The once fluid panzer formations became disjointed, leaving pockets of vulnerability that the Allies could exploit. The psychological impact on German troops was profound. Soldiers facing repeated losses, harsh desert conditions, and relentless artillery barrages experienced fatigue and declining morale. Witnessing British units advance despite counterattacks created uncertainty and anxiety, undermining confidence in leadership and strategy. Rommel, recognizing these challenges, sought to inspire resilience by personally overseeing critical sectors and coordinating armored counterstrikes, but the cumulative effects of prolonged pressure limited his ability to influence the battlefield effectively. British forces, capitalizing on Axis weaknesses, maintained continuous pressure, exploiting breaches and targeting isolated units. Artillery and air support complemented armored thrusts, ensuring that German counterattacks faced multiple layers of resistance. The Eighth Army's ability to integrate reconnaissance, artillery, armor, and infantry allowed for dynamic adaptation to Axis maneuvers, reducing the effectiveness of Rommel's defensive efforts. Small tactical victories during the Axis countermeasures reinforced Allied momentum. Even where British advances were temporarily halted, the ability to absorb counterattacks without significant losses demonstrated the robustness of Allied planning and logistics. Each repelled counterattack weakened Axis morale, depleted remaining resources, and further exposed the fragility of Rommel's overstretched lines. the desert environment amplified the attritional nature of these clashes. Open sands allowed for long-range artillery and tank engagements, but heat, dust, and uneven terrain hampered both sides. Vehicles became prone to overheating or mechanical failure, while infantry contended with fatigue, dehydration, and exposure. These factors compounded the challenges facing Axis forces, limiting the impact of counterattacks and making sustained resistance increasingly difficult. By the end of the day, Rommel's last defensive maneuvers had slowed the Allied advance in isolated sectors but failed to halt the broader momentum of the Eighth Army. British forces, strengthened by preparation, coordination, and reserves, maintained pressure across multiple axes, gradually eroding Axis positions and creating opportunities for decisive breakthroughs. The cumulative effect of attrition, desert conditions, and relentless offensive operations revealed the weakening cohesion of Rommel's once formidable army. In essence, these desperate countermeasures illustrated both the skill and limitations of the Desert Fox under extreme pressure. While Rommel's tactical acumen allowed for temporary resistance and localized successes, the combination of Allied preparation, superior coordination, and cumulative attritional effects steadily undermined Axis cohesion. The stage was set for the decisive final phase of the battle, where sustained Allied pressure would exploit these weaknesses and secure a strategic turning point in the North African campaign. The battle at El Alamein had reached a critical stage, where every meter of desert gained was measured not only in courage and firepower but also in the ability to overcome artificial and natural obstacles. Among these, minefields posed a particularly lethal challenge. The Germans had extensively mined forward positions, creating a deadly barrier intended to slow the British advance, channel armored formations, and inflict maximum casualties. For Montgomery and the Eighth Army, the solution lay in meticulous planning, skilled engineering, and coordinated assaults that could breach these lethal zones while maintaining momentum. British engineers became central to the operation, working under constant threat of artillery and small arms fire. They employed a combination of reconnaissance, mapping, and detection tools to locate mine concentrations and identify safe lanes for advancing units. Teams of sappers and pioneers moved systematically, often exposing themselves to enemy observation and fire, to clear paths through the desert's hidden death zones. Each cleared corridor was a fragile lifeline, permitting tanks, armored cars, and mechanized infantry to penetrate Axis defenses with reduced risk of catastrophic losses. Tank units followed closely behind the sappers, taking advantage of the cleared lanes to engage enemy positions and disrupt defensive formations. The concentrated firepower of armored brigades allowed the Allies to exploit breaches quickly, preventing the Axis from regrouping or reinforcing threatened sectors. Tanks advanced in coordinated columns, integrating artillery cover and infantry support, ensuring that the momentum generated by breaching the minefields translated into tangible tactical gains. The psychological impact of navigating minefields on both sides was significant. For British forces, the successful clearance of mines bolstered morale, demonstrating the effectiveness of training, planning, and courage under pressure. Engineers, infantry, and tank crews recognized that their collaboration was critical for operational success, creating a sense of shared purpose and confidence. Conversely, Axis forces witnessed their carefully laid defensive obstacles being neutralized, eroding confidence in their ability to slow the Allied advance and protect critical positions. German defensive lines, increasingly under pressure from combined arms attacks, began to show cracks as breaches widened. Where once the minefields had provided a formidable shield, now gaps allowed British tanks and infantry to penetrate and engage positions that had previously seemed secure. Artillery units and machine gun nests that relied on minefields to control movement found themselves exposed, forcing Axis commanders to divert reserves and attempt counterattacks under increasingly difficult conditions. Coordination was essential. Artillery barrages were timed to precede armored advances, suppressing defensive positions and preventing Axis troops from targeting engineers clearing mines. Infantry units flanked the advancing tanks, securing clear corridors and neutralizing any enemy resistance. Communication between units ensured that breaches were exploited efficiently, minimizing delays and reducing casualties. The synchronization of these elements exemplified modern combined arms doctrine, where engineering, mobility, and firepower were interdependent. Environmental conditions compounded the complexity of the operation. The desert's heat, shifting sands, and visibility challenges demanded constant vigilance. Mine detection and clearance were physically demanding, requiring teams to work in extreme temperatures while maintaining precision and focus. Tanks had to navigate uneven terrain and avoid hidden obstacles while under fire, testing both crew skill and mechanical reliability. The desert, unforgiving in both climate and terrain, magnified the risks and emphasized the importance of preparation and discipline. The breakthrough at the mines had strategic implications beyond the immediate tactical gains. By opening corridors through heavily fortified areas, the Allies could concentrate forces at critical points, disrupt Axis defensive cohesion, and create conditions for sustained offensive operations. Each successful breach increased pressure on Rommel's overstretched lines, forcing the redistribution of forces and exposing additional weaknesses that could be exploited in follow-on attacks. Ultimately, the operation highlighted the interplay of courage, engineering expertise, and combined arms coordination in overcoming artificial defensive obstacles. British forces demonstrated that minefields, while lethal, could be neutralized through preparation, skill, and integration of multiple combat arms. The Axis, faced with the erosion of their protective barriers, were increasingly vulnerable to concentrated assaults, setting the stage for decisive advances in the broader Battle of El Alamein. In conclusion, the breakthrough at the mines was more than a tactical success. It represented a turning point in operational capability. It showcased the effectiveness of coordinated planning, the resilience and skill of engineers and combat troops, and the ability to exploit enemy vulnerabilities systematically. By navigating these obstacles successfully, the British forces not only preserved momentum but also set conditions for the eventual collapse of Axis defenses, underscoring the decisive impact of preparation, ingenuity, and courage in desert warfare. The skies above the deserts of El Alamein had become a decisive theater in their own right, where control of the air directly influenced the outcome of ground operations. The Royal Air Force, RAF, alongside Allied desert air units, played a pivotal role in shaping the battlefield, providing reconnaissance, close air support, and interdiction that amplified the effectiveness of Montgomery's ground forces. With Rommel's panzer divisions stretched thin and his Luftwaffe contingent facing attrition and fuel shortages, the Allies increasingly dominated the air, leveraging this advantage to accelerate their advance and weaken Axis resistance. Reconnaissance missions were among the most critical tasks assigned to Allied pilots. Daily sorties scanned vast desert expanses, mapping Axis positions, supply routes, and troop movements. Observations were relayed in near real time to artillery units and field commanders, allowing for precise targeting of German and Italian formations. Identifying weak points, exposed armor, and concentrations of troops enabled the Eighth Army to plan assaults that maximized pressure while minimizing risk to advancing infantry and tanks. Accurate aerial intelligence thus transformed the battlefield from uncertainty to calculated action, giving the Allies an operational edge that Rommel increasingly struggled to counter. In addition to reconnaissance, Allied aircraft carried out strategic and tactical bombing operations. Concentrated strikes targeted Axis artillery positions, fortified bunkers, supply depots, and fuel stockpiles. These attacks disrupted enemy logistics, reduced the volume of fire the Axis could deliver to frontline positions, and inflicted both material and psychological damage. Repeated aerial bombardments forced Rommel to commit resources defensively, diverting troops and armor to protect critical assets rather than concentrate on countering the British offensive. Close air support further enhanced the effectiveness of ground operations. Fighter bombers and light bombers coordinated with advancing armored columns and infantry units, delivering precision strikes on enemy positions just ahead of the front lines. Tanks immobilized by artillery or terrain could be assisted by air attacks that neutralized nearby anti-tank emplacements, while infantry advancing under machine gun fire received suppressive strikes from above. This integration of air and ground operations exemplified modern combined arms tactics, where each component amplified the effectiveness of the others, creating a cumulative operational advantage. The Luftwaffe, once dominant in North Africa, found itself increasingly constrained. Attrition from prior engagements, extended supply lines, and fuel shortages limited the frequency and intensity of German air operations. Experienced pilots were lost in prior clashes, and replacements lacked the training to match the skill of Allied crews. Axis air units could no longer provide consistent support to ground formations, leaving Rommel's forces vulnerable to concentrated attacks from both artillery and advancing infantry and armor. The decline of Luftwaffe presence contributed directly to the erosion of German defensive cohesion and morale. Air superiority also had a psychological effect on both sides. For Allied troops, knowing that friendly aircraft were overhead boosted confidence, enabling infantry and armored units to advance with reduced fear of sudden enemy counterattacks. Soldiers witnessed the devastating effect of airstrikes on enemy formations, reinforcing the perception that Axis resistance could be systematically dismantled. Conversely, German troops faced constant harassment from above, diminishing morale and creating uncertainty about when and where the next strike might occur. Continuous pressure from the skies compounded the challenges of desert warfare, stretching attention, coordination, and resources thin across multiple fronts. Environmental conditions of the desert further emphasized the role of air power. Open terrain allowed pilots to observe movements over long distances and deliver precise attacks, while the lack of cover made Axis troops and vehicles highly vulnerable. Dust, heat, haze, and shifting sand, however, also created challenges, requiring skillful navigation and targeting to maintain operational effectiveness. RAF and Allied pilots adapted to these conditions, refining tactics to strike effectively despite the harsh desert environment. The cumulative effect of Allied air operations was evident on the ground. As reconnaissance identified weak points, artillery and tanks could focus on vulnerable sectors, maximizing the impact of attacks. Repeated bombing and strafing runs disrupted supply lines, prevented German reinforcements from reaching critical areas, and forced defensive redeployments. These factors contributed directly to the acceleration of the Allied advance, turning incremental gains into decisive pressure along the front. By maintaining sustained air superiority, the Allies were able to dictate the tempo of the battle, controlling where and when engagements occurred. Rommel's capacity to react was increasingly limited, as Axis armor and infantry had to contend not only with British and Commonwealth ground forces but also with persistent aerial threats. The combination of reconnaissance, bombing, and close air support transformed the operational environment, shifting initiative firmly to Montgomery and his commanders. In conclusion, Allied air power at El Alamein was a decisive element in the desert campaign. RAF and supporting air units provided reconnaissance, disrupted enemy logistics, and delivered close support that magnified the effectiveness of ground operations. Luftwaffe attrition and logistical constraints left Axis forces vulnerable, while coordinated air-ground operations allowed the Allies to exploit weaknesses systematically. the dominance of the skies enabled Montgomery to maintain momentum, pressure Rommel's forces, and set the stage for the decisive breakthroughs that would ultimately determine the outcome of the North African campaign. Air power, therefore, was not merely an adjunct to the battle, it was integral to the success of the final Allied offensive, shaping both strategy and the battlefield itself. By the time the Eighth Army pressed forward in the final stages of the Battle of El Alamein, the Axis defenses began to crumble under sustained Allied pressure. Months of attrition, combined with meticulously planned assaults and overwhelming coordination of infantry, armor, artillery, and air support, had weakened the once formidable panzer divisions and Italian units. Across multiple sectors of the front, German and Italian defensive lines showed clear signs of disintegration, marking the beginning of a decisive collapse that would determine the outcome of the North African campaign. In the forward sectors, British and Commonwealth troops exploited breaches created by sustained artillery bombardments and previous probing attacks. Infantry advanced with the support of armored brigades, pushing through previously fortified positions that had been compromised by earlier assaults. Machine gun nests, bunkers, and anti-tank positions were systematically neutralized, forcing Axis troops to retreat in disorder. Each successive breach compounded the vulnerability of surrounding units, creating gaps that further accelerated the collapse of defensive cohesion. Armored formations, once central to Rommel's tactical flexibility, struggled to respond. Fuel shortages, mechanical failures, and the cumulative effects of desert attrition limited the mobility of panzer divisions. British armor, benefiting from secured supply lines and careful coordination with infantry and artillery, was able to penetrate these weakened positions, outflank remaining strongpoints, and force hasty withdrawals. The rapid movement of tanks across breached sectors created cascading effects, as isolated Axis units found themselves cut off from reinforcements and resupply. Supply lines, the lifeblood of Rommel's forces, were under constant threat. Allied reconnaissance and air operations targeted convoys, depots, and transportation routes, further exacerbating shortages of fuel, ammunition, and food. Without reliable resupply, defensive positions became increasingly unsustainable. Infantry units, lacking sufficient artillery or armored support, were forced to fall back under pressure. This disruption amplified confusion and lowered the effectiveness of counterattacks, leaving the Axis scrambling to maintain a coherent line. Casualties mounted rapidly, affecting morale across German and Italian units. Losses among experienced officers and NCOs diminished command efficiency, while repeated exposure to concentrated attacks created fatigue and fear among enlisted troops. Soldiers who had once relied on Rommel's audacious tactics now confronted the relentless reality of coordinated Allied operations and attrition. The psychological impact of seeing defensive lines crumble, combined with environmental stresses such as desert heat and sandstorms, further accelerated the Axis decline. The collapse was not uniform, some pockets of resistance held temporarily, but these became isolated and eventually overwhelmed. Forward observation and rapid exploitation of breaches allowed British commanders to concentrate forces at critical points, ensuring that isolated strongholds were neutralized quickly. Artillery and close air support compounded the pressure, making organized countermeasures increasingly difficult. Rommel's attempts to stabilize sectors were hampered by the erosion of unit cohesion, the attrition of manpower, and the inability to respond flexibly under concentrated attacks. Strategically, the breakdown of Axis lines signaled a shift in initiative. For months, Rommel had maneuvered aggressively, dictating the pace of the campaign. Now, the momentum belonged to Montgomery and the Eighth Army. With Axis forces retreating in disorder, the Allies were able to dictate where and when engagements occurred, exploiting weaknesses and driving toward objectives that would secure the desert and open the path to Libya. The collapse of morale was evident not only in the battlefield movements but also in the behavior of retreating troops. Discipline frayed as units withdrew, leaving vehicles, weapons, and supplies behind. Communication lines were disrupted, preventing coordinated resistance and further compounding the sense of inevitable defeat. Soldiers faced the psychological strain of seeing previously impregnable positions lost and allies faltering, reinforcing the perception that the battle was turning irreversibly in favor of the Allies. On the operational level, Montgomery capitalized on this disintegration by concentrating reserves and reinforcing successful sectors. Exploitation of breached lines enabled deep thrusts into Axis-held territory, creating encirclements and forcing further withdrawals. The combination of pressure from artillery, armor, infantry, and air attacks ensured that Rommel's attempts to regroup or counterattack were ineffective, accelerating the pace of the collapse. By the end of this phase, it was evident that the Axis was no longer capable of mounting coordinated resistance. Defensive positions were breached on multiple fronts, armored formations were scattered or immobilized, and infantry units retreated in disarray. The cumulative effects of continuous Allied pressure, logistical disruption, and attritional losses had shattered the Desert Fox's defensive capabilities. In summary, the collapse of Axis forces at El Alamein was a direct result of sustained combined arms operations, strategic exploitation of weaknesses, and attritional pressure. British forces, executing meticulously planned assaults, overwhelmed overextended and fatigued German and Italian units. Supply shortages, casualties, and declining morale compounded the difficulty of mounting effective defenses or counterattacks. The breakthrough at multiple sectors signaled the beginning of the end for Rommel's North African campaign, establishing the conditions for a decisive Allied victory that would shift the strategic balance in the desert and the broader Mediterranean theater. As the Axis lines at El Alamein crumbled under relentless pressure, the British Eighth Army transitioned from defensive and preparatory operations to a full-scale pursuit across the desert, intent on exploiting the weakening German and Italian formations. The momentum gained from sustained artillery, armor, and infantry assaults allowed Montgomery to press forward, turning localized breakthroughs into an operational offensive that would pursue retreating forces, seize territory, and prevent the reorganization of Axis defenses. The pursuit relied heavily on the coordination of multiple arms. Armored divisions spearheaded the advance, leveraging speed and firepower to overtake retreating units, cut off escape routes, and engage rearguard positions. Tanks and mechanized infantry moved rapidly along cleared desert tracks, exploiting the open terrain to maintain contact with fleeing Axis formations. Behind them, motorized infantry and artillery units provided support, neutralizing pockets of resistance, securing key crossroads, and ensuring that captured ground could be held and expanded upon. Cavalry units, while limited in scale compared to armored brigades, played a critical role in screening flanks, pursuing isolated enemy detachments, and intercepting retreating convoys. Their mobility allowed for rapid intervention, preventing Axis units from regrouping and reinforcing vulnerable sectors. Coordinated reconnaissance and forward observation ensured that these advances remained informed, with commanders able to anticipate enemy movements and adjust the pursuit accordingly. Desert conditions, long a challenge for both sides, now favored the Allies. British forces, acclimated to the harsh environment and supported by robust logistics, could sustain long-range operations and rapid movement. Axis troops, exhausted from weeks of continuous engagement, suffering from attrition, and hindered by stretched supply lines, struggled to keep pace. Fuel shortages, mechanical breakdowns, and disorganization slowed retreats, leaving units vulnerable to encirclement and attack. The desert, which had previously masked and aided Rommel's maneuverability, now amplified the advantages of the pursuing Eighth Army. The pursuit was not without danger. Mines, booby-trapped positions, and sporadic artillery fire continued to threaten advancing troops. Engineers and sappers accompanied columns to clear routes and mitigate the risk of ambushes, ensuring that momentum was maintained without incurring unnecessary losses. Air support from the RAF provided reconnaissance and strafing runs, targeting rearguard elements and disrupting potential counterattacks, further enhancing the effectiveness of the pursuit. Psychologically, the pursuit had a significant impact. Allied troops, buoyed by recent victories and the evident weakening of enemy forces, pressed forward with confidence and determination. Conversely, Axis soldiers faced mounting demoralization, recognizing that the previously formidable Desert Fox was no longer able to marshal defenses effectively. Units retreating across the desert faced the dual pressures of relentless Allied pursuit and the harsh environmental conditions, compounding fatigue, disorganization, and loss of morale. The operational effect of the pursuit was profound. By maintaining continuous pressure, the Allies denied Rommel the opportunity to reorganize, fortify, or counterattack effectively. The destruction or capture of rearguard elements further depleted Axis manpower and equipment, accelerating the collapse of defensive capabilities. Strategic points such as crossroads, supply depots, and high ground were seized in rapid succession, extending the reach of the Eighth Army and consolidating the gains achieved during the initial offensive. As the pursuit continued, the Allied command emphasized maintaining momentum while minimizing overextension. Supply lines were carefully managed, reserves positioned to exploit breakthroughs, and reconnaissance ensured that rapid advances did not result in isolation or vulnerability. This balance allowed British forces to capitalize fully on the weaknesses exposed during the preceding battles, maximizing the operational advantage while keeping forces coordinated and effective. In essence, the pursuit across the desert showcased the integration of mobility, coordination, and initiative in modern warfare. The combination of armored spearheads, motorized infantry, artillery support, and air reconnaissance allowed the Allies to exploit the disintegration of Axis defenses fully. Desert conditions, once a challenge for maneuver, now accentuated Allied advantages, while the relentless pressure denied Rommel any chance to stabilize his forces. By the end of the pursuit phase, Axis forces were in disarray, retreating across open desert with minimal cohesion, depleted supplies, and mounting casualties. The operational success of the Eighth Army not only extended the battlefield gains from El Alamein but also set the stage for the broader Allied advance into Libya, the eventual encirclement of Axis troops, and the strategic domination of North Africa. The desert had borne witness to a transformation, from stalemate and attrition to relentless Allied momentum, demonstrating how preparation, coordination, and decisive action could exploit weaknesses and secure enduring victory. The victory at El Alamein came at an extraordinary cost, a harsh reminder that triumph in war is rarely measured solely by territorial gains or strategic advantage. Both Allied and Axis forces endured tremendous losses in men, material, and morale, with the desert environment compounding the effects of prolonged combat. Soldiers faced relentless artillery, armor clashes, and small arms fire, while also confronting the unforgiving conditions of the North African theater, intense heat, sandstorms, and the physical toll of extended operations. On the Allied side, the Eighth Army had invested months of effort to prepare, coordinate, and execute the offensive. Infantry units sustained casualties during assaults on fortified positions, with machine gun fire, artillery, and counterattacks inflicting heavy losses. Tank crews faced constant threats from enemy anti-tank guns and mines, while engineers clearing obstacles and breaching defenses exposed themselves to both fire and environmental hazards. The combination of combat stress and harsh conditions resulted in a high rate of injury, exhaustion, and disease, testing the endurance of even the most disciplined troops. Axis forces fared no better. German and Italian units, already strained by months of attrition, found themselves fighting in increasingly desperate circumstances. Overextended supply lines limited access to fuel, ammunition, and food, while damaged vehicles and equipment could not be repaired quickly. Units attempting counterattacks or rearguard actions faced exhaustion and low morale, and soldiers suffered from heat, dehydration, and fatigue alongside combat casualties. Attrition, compounded by environmental factors, eroded cohesion, reducing the effectiveness of Rommel's armored and infantry formations. Material losses were equally significant. Tanks, artillery pieces, and trucks were destroyed or abandoned in the desert, often irrecoverable due to sand, mines, and enemy fire. Ammunition and supply shortages created further operational constraints, limiting both sides' capacity to sustain offensive or defensive actions. The logistical challenge of moving and repairing equipment across the open desert magnified every loss, emphasizing the interplay between terrain, supply, and combat effectiveness. The human toll extended beyond the battlefield. Soldiers suffered from psychological strain, witnessing comrades killed or wounded, enduring long marches under fire, and coping with the relentless desert environment. Fatigue, heat exhaustion, and sleep deprivation combined with the threat of enemy fire to create a cumulative stress that affected performance, decision-making, and morale. Medical units worked tirelessly to treat wounds and illnesses, often under fire and with limited resources, reflecting the profound human cost of maintaining operations in such conditions. Environmental hazards compounded the already severe combat losses. The desert's heat during the day and cold at night caused additional physical strain. Sand infiltrated machinery and weapons, reducing their effectiveness, while storms and shifting dunes complicated movement and supply. Soldiers contended with dehydration, sunstroke, and sand-related injuries, which, when combined with combat wounds, created a scenario where nature itself became an enemy alongside the opposing army. The cost of victory was also strategically significant. While the Allies achieved a decisive operational advantage, the depletion of units, destruction of equipment, and attrition of trained personnel meant that follow-on operations required careful planning and reinforcement. Axis forces, though retreating, still retained elements capable of delaying further Allied advances, illustrating that victory in battle did not equate to an immediate end to the campaign. The human and material toll set the stage for continued fighting across North Africa, even after El Alamein had shifted the momentum. Despite these heavy losses, the psychological and moral effect of victory was profound. For the Allies, securing the desert through coordinated combined arms operations reinforced confidence in leadership, strategy, and training. The success validated months of meticulous planning, logistical preparation, and adaptation to the harsh desert environment. For Axis forces, the scale of losses and the disruption of Rommel's forces contributed to declining morale, compounding operational challenges and diminishing combat effectiveness in subsequent engagements. The battle demonstrated that sustained combat in extreme environments exacts a toll far beyond battlefield casualties. Heat, fatigue, exhaustion, and logistical difficulties magnify every loss, affecting not only soldiers' physical capacities but also their resilience and capacity to recover. El Alamein highlighted the interplay of human endurance, environmental challenges, and combat lethality, underscoring that strategic victories are inseparable from the sacrifices they entail. In conclusion, the cost of victory at El Alamein was multidimensional, encompassing physical, material, and psychological dimensions. The Eighth Army achieved operational success, breaking Axis defenses and securing a decisive momentum shift in the North African campaign, but at a steep price: thousands of casualties, destroyed equipment, and a relentless strain on human endurance. The desert itself, harsh and unyielding, amplified every hardship, making the triumph a testament not only to tactical skill and planning but also to the courage, endurance, and sacrifice of those who fought. The battle remains a stark reminder that victory in war is inseparable from its costs, measured in both lives and the resilience of those who endure extreme adversity. With Axis forces in retreat and the sands of El Alamein firmly under Allied pressure, Montgomery's leadership emerged as a defining factor in the North African campaign. The culmination of meticulous planning, strategic patience, and coordinated execution allowed the Eighth Army not only to achieve tactical successes but also to secure a decisive operational advantage, forcing Rommel to withdraw and ceding control of the desert to the Allies. Montgomery's approach combined thorough preparation with careful exploitation of intelligence. Reconnaissance, signals intelligence, and aerial observation had mapped the weaknesses in German and Italian positions, allowing him to concentrate artillery, armored brigades, and infantry units on sectors where breakthroughs would be most effective. By prioritizing coordination over audacity, Montgomery ensured that every unit acted in concert, magnifying the impact of each engagement and preventing the Axis from exploiting isolated gains. The consolidation of gains was a complex endeavor. As British and Commonwealth forces captured forward positions, engineers secured roads and cleared obstacles to facilitate the movement of armor and supply convoys. Artillery units were repositioned to provide continued support, while infantry secured captured territory, creating defensible positions that protected flanks and prepared for the next phase of operations. This careful orchestration prevented Rommel from regrouping or mounting effective counterattacks, reinforcing the perception of Allied dominance across the desert front. Air power played a complementary role in Montgomery's triumph. RAF reconnaissance missions provided real-time intelligence on Axis movements, while fighter bombers conducted strikes against rearguard units and supply lines. Luftwaffe attrition and limited operational reach meant that Axis forces were increasingly vulnerable from above, and British air superiority allowed ground forces to advance with reduced threat of aerial attack. Close coordination between air and ground units amplified the effectiveness of both, ensuring that each breakthrough was supported by overwhelming firepower. Montgomery's leadership was also evident in morale management and troop coordination. Soldiers, who had endured weeks of grueling combat, harsh desert conditions, and constant attrition, were reassured by visible planning, clear objectives, and the promise of support. High command ensured that units understood their roles and could trust in the effectiveness of neighboring formations. This clarity of purpose and cohesion proved essential in maintaining momentum and confidence, particularly during intense engagements against remaining Axis strongpoints. The retreat of Rommel's forces signaled the cumulative effect of strategic patience, logistical preparation, and disciplined execution. Depleted, exhausted, and overstretched, German and Italian units could not withstand the sustained pressure of combined arms operations. Tanks abandoned or immobilized due to fuel shortages, infantry units weakened by casualties, and disrupted supply lines left Rommel with little choice but to withdraw. Montgomery's ability to exploit these vulnerabilities ensured that the desert shifted firmly into Allied hands. Montgomery's triumph extended beyond battlefield victories. His methodical approach demonstrated the value of preparation, coordination, and intelligence integration in modern warfare. By consolidating gains effectively, he not only prevented Axis forces from counterattacking successfully but also positioned the Eighth Army for follow-on operations into Libya and beyond. The victory at El Alamein became a symbol of Allied competence and resilience, providing a critical morale boost for both troops and the broader war effort. The psychological impact on Axis forces was profound. Seeing their positions systematically breached, supply lines disrupted, and counterattacks repelled eroded confidence. Soldiers became demoralized, and Rommel's capacity to inspire and maneuver effectively diminished. Allied successes under Montgomery's leadership highlighted the interplay between tactical skill, operational planning, and psychological dominance, illustrating that battlefield control depends as much on morale and cohesion as on raw firepower. In the operational context, Montgomery's consolidation of gains allowed for flexible exploitation. Reserves could be committed to the most critical points, armored units could pursue retreating Axis formations, and artillery could continue to suppress remaining strongpoints. This dynamic approach ensured that victories were not isolated incidents but part of a continuous, coherent campaign designed to maximize strategic effect while minimizing Allied casualties. Ultimately, Montgomery's triumph at El Alamein represented a combination of strategic foresight, meticulous planning, and disciplined execution. By consolidating gains, maintaining momentum, and leveraging intelligence and air support, he transformed localized tactical successes into a decisive operational victory. Rommel's withdrawal marked the collapse of Axis resistance in Egypt, securing the desert for the Allies and setting the stage for subsequent campaigns across North Africa. This victory underscored the importance of leadership in modern warfare, demonstrating that careful preparation, coordinated action, and effective morale management can overcome formidable opponents. Montgomery's ability to integrate all elements of combat into a unified offensive ensured that the Eighth Army's success at El Alamein was not merely temporary but strategically decisive, reshaping the course of the North African campaign and marking a turning point in the Second World War. By the time the Eighth Army had fully consolidated its gains at El Alamein, the axis of the North African campaign had decisively shifted. Rommel, once hailed as the Desert Fox for his audacious maneuvers and tactical brilliance, now faced the stark reality of defeat under sustained Allied pressure. The meticulously planned Allied offensive, combined with superior coordination, logistics, and air support, had dismantled the Axis defensive network, leaving German and Italian forces in full retreat across the Libyan desert. The retreat was not a controlled withdrawal but a desperate flight to preserve what remained of Rommel's forces. Panzer divisions, already depleted by attrition and overstretched supply lines, were unable to regroup effectively. Tanks abandoned due to fuel shortages, vehicles damaged or destroyed in combat, and infantry fatigued and disoriented faced a punishing pursuit. British armored units and mechanized infantry exploited every gap, applying relentless pressure on retreating Axis formations, preventing them from establishing coherent defensive positions. Logistical collapse compounded the difficulties. Axis supply lines had been stretched to the breaking point, and Allied interdiction of convoys further reduced access to fuel, ammunition, and food. Units that might have formed the backbone of a counteroffensive were immobilized by shortages or scattered by rapid Allied advances. Communication breakdowns hindered coordination between panzer and infantry formations, leaving pockets of soldiers isolated and vulnerable to capture or destruction. The Desert Fox's ability to orchestrate effective maneuvers, once the hallmark of his reputation, was severely constrained by the operational environment and sustained Allied pressure. The psychological impact on Rommel's troops was profound. Morale, already weakened by prior defeats and harsh desert conditions, deteriorated further as units retreated under fire. Soldiers faced not only the physical challenges of desert movement but also the staggering realization that the tide had irrevocably turned against them. The aura of invincibility surrounding their commander, which had previously inspired fear in the Allies and confidence in his own men, was now undermined by the visible collapse of positions, losses of equipment, and relentless Allied pursuit. Rommel himself, renowned for his personal courage and tactical insight, faced an unprecedented strategic dilemma. The combination of depleted forces, disrupted supply, and overwhelming Allied momentum left him with few options. Any attempt to counterattack or stabilize positions risked catastrophic losses, while continued retreat required careful management to preserve the remnants of his army. Despite his skill, the Desert Fox's command was constrained by circumstances beyond his control, illustrating the limits of even the most brilliant leadership under sustained operational pressure. Allied operations played a central role in precipitating this defeat. Montgomery's emphasis on combined arms coordination, integration of air support, and exploitation of intelligence meant that Rommel faced simultaneous threats on multiple fronts. Artillery, armored units, infantry, and airstrikes worked in concert to neutralize defensive positions, cut off retreat routes, and apply continuous pressure, leaving little opportunity for effective Axis resistance. The pace and coordination of the Eighth Army denied Rommel the tactical flexibility that had defined his prior campaigns. The broader implications of Rommel's defeat extended beyond immediate tactical considerations. The collapse of his forces secured the Suez Canal in Egypt, denied Axis access to critical oil resources in Libya, and established a launching point for further Allied advances into North Africa. Strategic momentum firmly shifted, marking a turning point in the Mediterranean theater. The symbolic loss of the Desert Fox's invincibility reinforced Allied morale while undermining Axis confidence across the theater. In sum, the fall of the Desert Fox at El Alamein was the result of sustained Allied pressure, meticulous coordination, and exploitation of Axis weaknesses. Logistics, attrition, and environmental factors compounded the challenges faced by Rommel, while the integration of combined arms operations by Montgomery transformed tactical successes into operational dominance. The retreat across Libya was not merely a withdrawal but a decisive demonstration of Allied superiority, signaling the beginning of the end for Axis forces in North Africa and permanently shattering the myth of Rommel's invincibility. The battle demonstrated that even commanders of legendary skill could not overcome cumulative attrition, stretched supply lines, and coordinated, multidimensional opposition. Rommel's tactical brilliance, once the hallmark of German campaigns in the desert, was neutralized by preparation, planning, and the relentless execution of a superior strategy. The fall of the Desert Fox marked both a strategic and symbolic victory for the Allies, underscoring the decisive importance of planning, coordination, and resilience in modern warfare. The capture and securement of El Alamein represented a pivotal moment in the North African campaign, solidifying Allied control over a region critical to the broader war effort. With Axis forces in full retreat, the Eighth Army had not only defeated Rommel tactically but had achieved a strategic victory with far-reaching consequences. The significance of El Alamein extended beyond the battlefield. It ensured the defense of Egypt, safeguarded the Suez Canal, and created conditions for the Allies to press into Libya and eventually Tunisia. Allied forces, having consolidated gains from the relentless offensive and pursuit, established defensible positions across the former Axis front lines. Artillery emplacements were reinforced, infantry units secured high ground and crossroads, and armor was deployed to cover likely avenues of retreat. Engineers cleared obstacles, repaired desert tracks, and prepared routes for advancing forces, ensuring that the army could maintain momentum without risking overextension. The meticulous consolidation of territory allowed the Allies to convert operational success into strategic advantage, providing a secure base for future operations in North Africa. The strategic implications were profound. By holding El Alamein, the Allies controlled the gateway to Egypt, which remained essential for protecting the Suez Canal, a critical artery for British logistics, oil supplies, and imperial communication. Axis forces were denied access to the canal and key resources, while the Allies gained freedom of movement for reinforcements, supplies, and subsequent offensives. The victory also boosted morale across Allied nations, demonstrating that the Axis could be decisively defeated when superior coordination and planning were combined with effective combat execution. Rommel's retreat into Libya marked a significant shift in momentum. Depleted, demoralized, and unable to regroup effectively, Axis forces were increasingly reactive rather than proactive. The loss of El Alamein removed the possibility of further offensive operations in Egypt and forced a strategic withdrawal across the desert. This retreat allowed the Allies to pursue, harass, and contain Axis units, preventing them from establishing new defensive positions while simultaneously preparing for future campaigns. The operational consequences of securing El Alamein extended beyond immediate territorial gains. The defeat of the Desert Fox disrupted Axis logistics, depleted experienced troops, and eliminated the illusion of invincibility that had previously inspired both German and Italian forces. Allied air and ground coordination had proven decisive, showing the effectiveness of combined arms operations in desert warfare. The battle reinforced the importance of integrating intelligence, logistics, and meticulous planning to exploit enemy weaknesses and achieve sustainable victories. Psychologically, the victory had significant effects. Allied troops, emboldened by the success, gained confidence in leadership and operational strategy. Soldiers recognized that months of attrition, preparation, and coordinated attacks could produce decisive outcomes against even highly skilled adversaries. Conversely, Axis troops faced not only physical losses but also a decline in morale. The perceived invincibility of Rommel and his panzer divisions was shattered, creating uncertainty and hesitation that hindered future operations. From a broader strategic perspective, securing El Alamein provided a launching point for subsequent operations across North Africa. The Allies could now press into Libya, targeting key cities and supply lines to further degrade Axis capabilities. The victory also laid the groundwork for eventual advances into Tunisia, where combined Allied operations would continue to exploit the weaknesses exposed at El Alamein. In this sense, the battle was not an isolated victory but a crucial step in the overall campaign to expel Axis forces from North Africa. The capture of El Alamein also carried symbolic weight. For the Allies, it demonstrated that careful planning, resilience, and effective use of combined arms could overcome even highly skilled adversaries. It provided a morale boost for the British Commonwealth and American forces entering the theater, reinforcing the belief that sustained, coordinated effort could decisively alter the course of the war. For the Axis, it represented a psychological blow, undermining confidence and signaling that the momentum in North Africa had irrevocably shifted. In conclusion, the securing of El Alamein was a decisive turning point in the North African campaign. The Allied victory ensured the defense of Egypt and the Suez Canal, shattered Axis defensive cohesion, and allowed for subsequent advances into Libya and Tunisia. It demonstrated the effectiveness of combined arms operations, meticulous planning, and sustained pressure in modern warfare. Beyond the battlefield, the victory provided a profound psychological boost for Allied forces while undermining the aura of invincibility surrounding Rommel and his troops. El Alamein thus stands not only as a tactical and operational triumph but as a strategic milestone that reshaped the trajectory of the North African campaign and contributed decisively to the broader Allied war effort. Following the decisive victory at El Alamein, the Allied Eighth Army swiftly transitioned from consolidation to a relentless pursuit across the Libyan desert, exploiting the disintegration of Axis defenses. The retreating German and Italian forces, already weakened by months of attrition and continuous pressure, faced a combination of strategic harassment, rapid Allied advances, and logistical challenges that compounded their losses and eroded cohesion. Montgomery recognized that momentum was critical. Halting the advance, even temporarily, could allow Rommel to regroup and potentially stabilize the front. Therefore, the Eighth Army pressed forward with careful coordination, integrating mobility, supply management, and combined arms tactics to maximize the effect of the Axis collapse. The desert, a harsh and unforgiving environment, both aided and tested the Allies. Open terrain facilitated rapid movement for tanks, armored vehicles, and mechanized infantry, allowing British forces to outmaneuver retreating Axis units. reconnaissance patrols scouted ahead, identifying escape routes, weak positions, and opportunities to interdict supply convoys. Engineers cleared mined roads, repaired damaged tracks, and prepared routes to sustain the advance, ensuring that armored columns could maintain speed and offensive pressure. The integration of logistics with operational movement demonstrated a mastery of desert warfare, allowing the Eighth Army to capitalize fully on Axis vulnerabilities. German forces struggled to maintain order during the retreat. Panzer divisions, exhausted from prior engagements, faced mechanical breakdowns, fuel shortages, and insufficient ammunition. Infantry units, already depleted, were forced to conduct rearguard actions under constant harassment from Allied armor and artillery. Communication breakdowns further undermined cohesion, leaving isolated pockets of troops vulnerable to encirclement or destruction. The retreat across the open desert became not merely a withdrawal but a testing ground for endurance, morale, and improvisation, as Axis soldiers sought to evade capture while maintaining any semblance of organization. Allied armored and motorized units were the spearhead of the pursuit. Coordinated columns struck at key points along retreating lines, disrupting movement and preventing reformation of defensive positions. Cavalry and reconnaissance units moved ahead to screen flanks and intercept convoys, while artillery units provided suppressive fire against rearguards and fortified positions. Air support from the RAF targeted retreating units, destroyed vehicles, and cut supply lines, magnifying the psychological and operational pressure on Axis troops. The synergy of land and air forces ensured that retreating German and Italian units could not stabilize or mount counterattacks, accelerating the collapse of resistance. The human cost of the pursuit was significant. Exhausted Axis soldiers faced relentless harassment, heat, fatigue, and exposure. Casualties mounted not only from direct combat but from environmental hazards, including desert heat, dehydration, and mechanical failures that immobilized vehicles and armored units. Allied forces, though advancing with operational advantage, were also tested by the extreme conditions, requiring careful management of supply, water, and fuel to sustain the chase across hundreds of kilometers of desert terrain. The pursuit also had profound psychological effects. Allied troops, emboldened by the success at El Alamein and witnessing the disarray of enemy forces, pressed forward with confidence and determination. Morale was high as soldiers realized that they were not simply holding gains but actively shaping the strategic situation across North Africa. Conversely, Axis troops confronted not only physical exhaustion but the psychological impact of witnessing the systematic dismantling of their formations, the loss of territory, and the erosion of Rommel's tactical dominance. Logistics and mobility were critical. Supply lines for the Allies were carefully coordinated to maintain the pace of the advance, ensuring that tanks and mechanized units had fuel, ammunition, and support while moving rapidly across the desert. Engineering units repaired and maintained routes, cleared obstacles, and enabled swift maneuvers. This meticulous attention to operational support ensured that the pursuit was sustained without losing momentum, amplifying the effects of Axis disorganization and attrition. By the end of the pursuit, Axis forces had suffered heavy losses in men, armor, and morale. Units were fragmented, supplies exhausted, and the ability to mount coordinated defensive actions severely limited. The Eighth Army's advance not only captured territory but also systematically reduced the operational capability of German and Italian forces, setting the stage for further Allied advances into Libya and the eventual strategic dominance of North Africa. In conclusion, the pursuit across the desert following El Alamein demonstrated the critical interplay of speed, coordination, and exploitation of enemy weakness. Allied forces leveraged mobility, logistics, reconnaissance, and combined arms tactics to press retreating Axis units relentlessly, eroding cohesion and inflicting sustained attritional losses. The desert, once a neutralizing factor for maneuver, became an arena where Allied operational superiority was decisive. Rommel's army, previously celebrated for audacity in maneuver, was now in disarray, and the strategic initiative in North Africa had irreversibly shifted to the Allies, paving the way for the eventual liberation of Libya and the further degradation of Axis power in the region. The relentless pursuit of Axis forces across the Libyan desert following El Alamein culminated in a decisive collapse of German and Italian units, effectively breaking the back of Rommel's previously formidable army. The combination of continuous pressure from Allied armored divisions, infantry, artillery, and air support, coupled with logistical and environmental challenges, prevented Axis forces from reorganizing or establishing coherent defensive lines. Units that might have stabilized the front were either destroyed in combat, forced to retreat under fire, or surrendered in isolated pockets, marking the final unraveling of the Desert Fox's operational capability. The inability of German and Italian forces to regroup reflected both the physical attrition of men and material and the psychological toll imposed by sustained Allied operations. Tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces abandoned in the desert, combined with exhausted infantry units, severely limited the capacity to mount counterattacks or establish new defensive positions. Fuel shortages, disrupted supply chains, and damage to vehicles and equipment compounded the difficulties, rendering even seasoned formations incapable of coordinated resistance. Allied forces capitalized on this disorganization through targeted exploitation of weak points, encirclement of isolated units, and the maintenance of rapid operational momentum. Cavalry, mechanized infantry, and armor advanced into sectors left undefended by retreating forces, capturing strategic positions and forcing additional surrenders. RAF and other Allied air units harassed remaining Axis formations, striking convoys, artillery positions, and troop concentrations, ensuring that no unit could reconstitute effectively. The synergy of air and ground operations amplified the collapse, turning isolated retreats into a strategic rout. The surrender of isolated pockets further accelerated the collapse. Small garrisons, cut off from supply and command, faced the choice of annihilation or capitulation. Many opted to surrender rather than face certain destruction, adding to the cumulative weakening of Axis forces. The psychological impact on remaining troops was profound. Confidence in Rommel's ability to regroup was eroded, morale plummeted, and cohesion disintegrated across units still attempting organized withdrawal. By the end of these operations, the strategic initiative in North Africa had fully shifted to the Allies. With Rommel's forces fragmented, depleted, and unable to resist effectively, Montgomery's Eighth Army was free to consolidate gains, secure key lines of communication, and prepare for further offensives into Libya and beyond. The collapse of Axis operational capability marked a turning point in the North African theater, ensuring that future engagements would occur under conditions favorable to the Allies. In conclusion, the Axis collapse was the result of sustained Allied pressure, meticulous exploitation of vulnerabilities, and the cumulative effects of attrition, environmental challenges, and psychological strain. German and Italian forces were unable to regroup, leading to the surrender of isolated pockets and the complete loss of strategic initiative. The defeat at El Alamein and its follow-on operations in Libya demonstrated that careful coordination, momentum, and combined arms superiority could decisively neutralize even a previously dominant force, establishing the Allies' operational dominance across North Africa. Montgomery's leadership at El Alamein became emblematic of meticulous planning, strategic patience, and effective execution. Unlike prior engagements, where attrition and improvisation often dictated outcomes, Montgomery emphasized intelligence-driven operations, combining information from reconnaissance, ultra-intercepts, and aerial observation to develop precise plans that targeted Axis weaknesses. His approach ensured that every element, infantry, armor, artillery, and air support functioned cohesively, creating a synergy that amplified the impact of each engagement and maximized operational effectiveness. The integration of combined arms tactics was central to Montgomery's mastery. Artillery barrages were carefully synchronized with infantry advances and armored thrusts, softening enemy positions and preventing Axis units from regrouping. Tanks and mechanized units exploited breaches in defensive lines, supported by infantry and engineers clearing obstacles, mines, and defensive works. Simultaneously, air units provided reconnaissance, interdiction, and close support, neutralizing Axis supply lines and rearguard positions. This coordination ensured that advances were decisive, minimizing exposure and reducing casualties while sustaining momentum across multiple sectors. Montgomery also emphasized morale, discipline, and unit cohesion as critical factors in operational success. Troops were briefed meticulously, informed of objectives, and confident in the support they could expect from adjacent units. Maintaining morale was particularly vital in the harsh desert environment, where heat, sand, and prior attrition could undermine performance. Soldiers trusted leadership, understood the plan, and executed their roles with discipline, contributing directly to operational efficiency and success. Intelligence played a pivotal role in Montgomery's strategy. Ultra-decrypts and reconnaissance reports allowed him to anticipate Axis movements, position artillery effectively, and allocate reserves to critical sectors. By exploiting information advantages, the Allies could apply concentrated pressure at decisive points, neutralizing German and Italian counterattacks before they could consolidate, and ensuring that gains were not temporary but strategically meaningful. Montgomery's cautious yet decisive approach also minimized Allied casualties. Unlike previous desert engagements, where rapid thrusts often resulted in high attrition, his plans accounted for logistics, terrain, and the enemy's likely reactions. Engineers and logistical units ensured that supply lines kept pace with advancing formations, artillery maintained continuous support, and reserves were ready to exploit breakthroughs. This attention to operational detail allowed the Eighth Army to consolidate gains efficiently while preserving combat strength for subsequent phases. The impact of Montgomery's leadership extended beyond battlefield tactics. His ability to coordinate large-scale operations under challenging desert conditions demonstrated the principles of modern warfare: integration of intelligence, mobility, firepower, and communication. It provided a template for subsequent Allied operations in North Africa and beyond, emphasizing that decisive victories require not only courage and firepower but also meticulous planning, coordination, and exploitation of information. By the conclusion of the battle, Montgomery had achieved a decisive operational and strategic victory. Allied forces not only repelled Axis offensives but also seized the initiative, forcing Rommel's army into a disorganized retreat. The Eighth Army's consolidation of gains, combined with minimized casualties and effective use of combined arms operations, underscored the efficacy of Montgomery's methodical leadership. His mastery ensured that El Alamein was not merely a tactical success but a strategic turning point in the North African campaign. In summary, Montgomery's performance at El Alamein exemplified the importance of leadership, planning, and integration in modern warfare. Through careful coordination of intelligence, artillery, armored units, infantry, and air support, he maximized operational impact while minimizing casualties. His ability to consolidate gains, maintain momentum, and exploit enemy weaknesses transformed a challenging desert battlefield into a decisive victory, establishing the Allies' strategic dominance in North Africa and setting the stage for the subsequent campaigns that would ultimately liberate the region from Axis control. The victory at El Alamein, while strategically decisive, came at a staggering human cost, underscoring the brutal realities of modern desert warfare. Both Allied and Axis forces endured significant casualties in men and material, with thousands killed, wounded, or captured during the protracted engagements across the Egyptian desert. The open terrain, combined with intense artillery, tank, and infantry clashes, created a battlefield where every advance exacted a heavy toll. Casualties were not confined to frontline combat. Support units, engineers, and logistical personnel often faced artillery fire, air raids, and the ever-present dangers of mines and desert hazards. The harsh desert environment compounded the suffering of soldiers on both sides. Daytime temperatures soared, leading to heat exhaustion, dehydration, and sunstroke, while nights brought frigid conditions that tested endurance and morale. Troops struggled with sand-laden equipment, limited water supplies, and the logistical difficulty of sustaining prolonged operations in remote locations. Medical facilities, often overwhelmed, were forced to treat injuries and illnesses under austere conditions, exacerbating the human cost of combat. Disease, malnutrition, and exposure claimed lives alongside bullets and shells, highlighting that the desert itself was a relentless adversary. Wounded soldiers faced arduous evacuations across difficult terrain, often under continued enemy fire. Ambulances, stretcher-bearers, and field medics operated in extreme heat and dust, performing triage and treatment with limited supplies. Many injuries that might have been survivable under better conditions became fatal, and the psychological strain of continuous combat amplified fatigue and stress. Both Allied and Axis forces were pushed to the limits of human endurance, demonstrating that the human cost extended beyond battlefield casualties to encompass exhaustion, trauma, and the relentless challenges imposed by the environment. For the Axis, the human toll was magnified by attrition and logistical strain. German and Italian troops, stretched thin and forced to defend extended lines, suffered heavily in repeated counterattacks and defensive operations. Supply shortages of food, fuel, and ammunition limited their ability to sustain combat effectiveness, while exhaustion and the loss of experienced personnel eroded cohesion. Soldiers faced the dual pressures of relentless Allied advances and the desert's harshness, resulting in elevated mortality, desertion, and surrender. On the Allied side, troops also bore the burden of casualties, although operational coordination and robust logistics mitigated some of the environmental challenges. Nevertheless, the intensity of artillery barrages, armored clashes, and infantry assaults created significant losses. Soldiers endured long marches across unforgiving terrain, exposure to extreme temperatures, and the physical and psychological strain of continuous combat. The human cost extended to engineers, medical staff, and support personnel, who worked tirelessly under fire to maintain the operational capability of advancing formations. Psychologically, the human toll manifested in stress, fatigue, and trauma. Soldiers witnessed friends and comrades killed, suffered constant threat from artillery and air attacks, and faced the anxiety of navigating mined and hostile terrain. The strain on leadership was equally significant, as officers balanced the demands of operational success with the imperative to minimize unnecessary loss of life. Morale fluctuated with the ebb and flow of combat, reinforcing the reality that victory in desert warfare required not only strategic skill but also endurance, resilience, and courage under extreme conditions. The human cost of El Alamein extended beyond the immediate battlefield. Families of fallen soldiers faced grief, and communities experienced the wider societal impact of sustained losses. Wounded personnel required months of recovery, and veterans carried the physical and psychological scars of combat for life. The desert, in this sense, became a crucible where the limits of human endurance were tested, producing both heroism and profound suffering. In reflection, the El Alamein campaign highlights that strategic victories are inseparable from their human consequences. While Allied forces achieved a decisive operational and strategic advantage, the cost was measured in thousands of lives lost, widespread injuries, and the enduring hardships faced by soldiers. The desert amplified every hardship, from combat casualties to environmental stresses, creating a scenario where endurance, skill, and courage were as crucial as tactics and firepower. Ultimately, the battle's human cost underscores the stakes of modern warfare. Success was achieved not without sacrifice, and the soldiers' resilience and perseverance were integral to operational outcomes. The sands of El Alamein bore witness not only to the triumph of Allied strategy but also to the profound sacrifices of those who fought, a testament to the price of victory in one of the most pivotal theaters of World War II. The victory at El Alamein stands as a defining turning point in the Second World War, marking the beginning of the end for Axis ambitions in North Africa and setting the stage for subsequent Allied offensives across the Mediterranean. By decisively halting Rommel's advance and securing Egypt, the Allies ensured control over the Suez Canal, a vital lifeline for British imperial communications, oil supplies, and logistical operations. This achievement not only safeguarded critical infrastructure but also provided the Allies with a secure base from which to plan and execute further operations across Libya, Tunisia, and ultimately into Italy. The strategic momentum generated by El Alamein was profound. For months, Axis forces had advanced rapidly across North Africa, threatening Allied positions and destabilizing the Mediterranean theater. The success of Montgomery's meticulously coordinated offensive reversed this trend, forcing Rommel into a retreat under pressure and eroding the operational capability of German and Italian units. The Eighth Army's exploitation of breaches, combined with relentless pursuit, further reduced Axis cohesion and morale, ensuring that the initiative in the theater shifted firmly to the Allies. El Alamein's legacy extends beyond its immediate operational and strategic impact. The battle became a symbol of Allied planning, coordination, and resilience. Montgomery's integration of intelligence, artillery, armored units, infantry, and air support showcased the effectiveness of combined arms warfare in modern conflicts, demonstrating that meticulous preparation and cohesive execution could decisively overcome even the most skilled adversaries. For the Allies, it reinforced confidence in leadership and strategy, proving that careful planning and disciplined execution could deliver decisive results against formidable opponents. The battle also had significant psychological and moral implications. For Axis forces, the defeat shattered the aura of invincibility surrounding Rommel, the Desert Fox, undermining morale and signaling the beginning of a broader strategic decline. For Allied troops, the victory at El Alamein validated months of training, coordination, and perseverance in harsh desert conditions, boosting confidence and morale across the Mediterranean theater. Civilians and soldiers alike recognized that the tide of war in North Africa had irrevocably turned, instilling hope and determination for the campaigns ahead. In operational terms, El Alamein secured key logistical routes and positions, enabling the Allies to consolidate gains and prepare for follow-on operations into Libya and Tunisia. Control of supply lines and desert corridors allowed armored and infantry units to advance with reduced risk, while artillery and air support maintained pressure on retreating Axis forces. The strategic depth gained through El Alamein provided a foundation for subsequent offensives, ensuring that the Allies could project force, exploit weaknesses, and maintain operational tempo across a wide and challenging theater. El Alamein also became a defining example of modern desert warfare, illustrating how environmental conditions, logistics, and combined arms operations interact to shape outcomes. The battle demonstrated the critical importance of intelligence, reconnaissance, and supply management in sustaining offensive momentum. Allied forces adapted to desert conditions more effectively than the Axis, leveraging mobility, coordination, and firepower to turn previously static fronts into opportunities for decisive action. The broader implications of El Alamein resonated well beyond the desert. By securing North Africa, the Allies ensured the protection of the Mediterranean, facilitating subsequent campaigns in Sicily and Italy. The victory demonstrated to both Axis and Allied nations that resilience, planning, and coordinated execution could overcome previously dominant forces, altering strategic calculations across multiple theaters of war. It became a benchmark for operational excellence and a symbol of Allied capability and unity. Symbolically, El Alamein represents the triumph of perseverance, preparation, and cohesion. Soldiers endured grueling conditions, sustained intense combat, and operated under extreme environmental stress, yet their collective effort produced a decisive outcome. The victory illustrated that strategic foresight, integration of forces, and unwavering resolve could achieve results beyond the sum of individual contributions. Montgomery's leadership exemplified this principle, demonstrating that modern warfare demanded coordination, intelligence, and discipline as much as courage and firepower. In historical memory, El Alamein has been immortalized as a turning point in the North African campaign. It marked the first time in the desert that Rommel's forces were decisively halted, forced into retreat, and prevented from threatening Egypt and the Suez Canal. The battle demonstrated the strategic value of preparation, combined arms integration, and operational momentum, serving as a model for subsequent Allied campaigns. It remains a testament to the ability of disciplined, coordinated forces to overcome formidable adversaries, even under challenging environmental conditions. In conclusion, El Alamein's legacy is multifaceted. It ensured the defense of critical Allied territories, shifted strategic momentum across North Africa, and laid the foundation for further advances into Libya, Tunisia, and Italy. The battle became a symbol of Allied resilience, planning, and coordination, highlighting the decisive impact of leadership, intelligence, and combined arms operations. Beyond its immediate operational significance, El Alamein endures as a historical milestone, representing the moment when the tide of war in North Africa irrevocably turned in favor of the Allies, demonstrating that careful preparation, cohesion, and resolve could decisively overcome even the most celebrated adversaries of the era.